Chapter 2086. First it was the Titan wine, then it was the Maotai wine. These two divine wines were released one after another, pushing this wine-tasting conference to the climax and making the other wines play a supporting role. All 60 groups of wines had been selected, and the scores had been announced. What made everyone curious was who the Wine Association would award the only gold award to. The Titan wine and Maotai wine had both received full marks. The 5 judges on stage discussed with the other 5 judges and tasted the 2 wines on the spot before finally reaching an agreement. Fergus walked up the stage again and gestured for everyone to be quiet. The venue quickly quieted down, and everyone looked expectantly at this esteemed president. He was going to announce the final winners of this wine-tasting conference. Fergus looked at everyone and said in a loud voice, "This wine-tasting conference has brought us a huge surprise, but also a huge challenge. There is an endless stream of fine wines, and the hard work and breakthroughs of the winemakers in the past year have been a pleasant surprise. However, the fine wines also made our selection more difficult and complicated. For example, the Titan wine that has been in the cellar for 30 years, and the Maotai wine that stunned everyone on its debut. To choose a better wine between the two as the gold award is like asking us which is more important, our wife or our mother. It's simply making things difficult for all the judges." Everyone smiled knowingly. The president was still so humorous and witty. Fergus raised his voice again and said, "So, after careful consideration, we have finally decided to make an exception for this wine-tasting conference. The Titan wine and Maotai wine will both receive the gold award." The venue was silent for a while, and soon there was an uproar. Double gold award. This had never happened before in a wine-tasting conference. The tavern owners looked at Meg and Effie enviously. This was equivalent to getting a guaranteed performance for the next year. The Titan Tavern had regained its glory, and the newly opened Saipan Tavern would soon become one of the busiest taverns in Rodu. Congratulations to the Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern. Now let's invite the 2 tavern owners to come up to receive the gold award, the host said. "That's great. There's actually another gold award." Effie was so surprised that she almost jumped up. She's quite flexible. Meg also nodded with a smile. Meg and Effie stood up and walked up the stage. The 2 of them were around 30 years old and looked to be in the prime of their lives. Everyone below the stage envied them. Fergus and Kurt each held a large golden wine cup with the words Wine Conference Gold Medal engraved on it. "I hope you can inherit Marcus' mantle and continue to pass on the Titan wine." Kurt gave the trophy to Eiffel and encouraged. AI Faye held the trophy with both hands and nodded seriously. "Thank you, I will do my best." Young and promising, the younger generation will surpass us in time. Fergus handed the trophy over to Meg and smiled. "I've brought out next year's trophy as an emergency. I hope to see you bring even better Maotai next year." The audience burst into laughter. "No, Maotai is the best." Meg shook his head. Everyone looked at Meg in surprise. Were all the youngsters nowadays so arrogant? Fergus also looked at Meg. "But if I come again next year, I'll definitely bring other wines. I might have to prepare another trophy." Meg raised the trophy in his hand and looked at the sparkling colors. "My girl should like it very much." Fergus and the people below the stage all laughed. "Young man, you're very interesting. You're to my liking." Fergus reached out and patted Meg on the shoulder. "Then I look forward to what kind of surprise you can bring us next year." Meg and Effie stepped down and returned to their seats. After the gold award came the silver award. The explosive wine and 4 other wines from Reese Tavern won the silver award of this wine conference. No one had expected that the explosive wine, which was regarded as the most likely to win the gold award, would be beaten by the Titan wine and Maotai wine in succession. The high score of 48 points seemed somewhat overshadowed. After the announcement of the bronze award wine, the highlight of this wine conference came to a perfect end. "Congratulations." "Same to you." Meg and Effie left the church together with a knowing smile. Meg was very gratified. The Titan wine regained the gold award and would add a fire to his real estate speculation business that would continue to burn. Meanwhile, Effie was looking at Mag with admiration and gratitude in her eyes. If it wasn't for Meg tearing off the seal of the wine cellar and letting her use the Titan wine in the competition, she wouldn't have been able to stand on the podium and receive the trophy that belonged to her father. And Meg himself received the Gold Award trophy very calmly, as if he had expected it. Meg and the others came out of the church and saw Amy and sitting on the swing in front of the church with a pile of delicious food in their hands. Irina stood not far away, and Mara was guarding the two children.
Miss,
We won the Gold Award. Mara looked at the trophy in Effie's hands and ran over with her eyes shining. Her face was full of surprise. Yes, our Titan wine won the Gold Award. Effie nodded with a smile. That's great, that's great. Mara carefully stroked the Gold Award trophy, tears already falling down her face. Meg took the trophy to the swing. Wow. Father, is this made of gold? Amy put the plate in her hands on the swing and jumped down. She looked at the trophy in Meg's hands and asked with shining eyes. It should be. Meg smiled and handed the trophy to Amy, who had already wiped her hands. I'll know once I try it. Amy opened her mouth and bit the trophy, leaving 2 neat rows of teeth marks on the rim. Yes, it's soft. It's real. Amy nodded with experience. It seems that participating in this competition has some value. Irina took the trophy and flicked her fingers. The wine glass made a pleasant sound. Double Gold Award. Our neighbor also won a Gold Award. It seems that the price of the house I invested in is going to increase, Meg said with a smile. She's quite popular, Irina said with a smile. Mag turned around to take a look. Effie was talking to a middle-aged man who was wearing a golden robe. He had an impression of that man. It was Boris, the owner of Boris Tavern. If it wasn't for the Titan wine and Moutai wine that came out of nowhere, the Gold Award wine of this wine-tasting conference would have been their wine. The lean and capable Boris looked quite elegant, a typical eligible bachelor. However, he didn't look like he was flirting with Effie, but more like he was discussing something. Meg had no intention of interfering with Effie's life. He looked at Irina with a smile and asked, "The main event of the wine-tasting conference is over. There will be a banquet in a while. Should we go back or eat at home?" What do the children think? Irina looked at Amy and Anne. We just got to the kitchen. There's a kind fat uncle there. He's already given us all their delicious food. Amy stuffed a fried meatball into her mouth and shook her head. So we can eat at home. Chapter 2087. Meg respected the children's choice very much, so he held the golden trophy and left the manor with his family. He was about to hail a carriage by the roadside to go home. After waiting for a while, Meg finally saw a passing carriage. He stopped it and carried Amy into the carriage before letting and Irina into the carriage. "Hello, Mr. Hades. Can I have a moment of your time?" Meg was about to get into the carriage when he was stopped. Meg retracted his leg and turned to look at the person who came. He knew the person who came. It was Mr. Boris, who had combed his hair into an adult style. "May I know what's the matter?" Meg asked him. "I am Boris. Congratulations on your Moutai wine winning the gold medal at the wine tasting conference." Boris smiled and extended his hand to Meg. "Thank you." Meg gave him a handshake before retracting his hand. "Congratulations to you for winning the silver award for your explosive wine." Boris's mouth twitched. If he hadn't met Meg and Effie, his explosive wine would have won the gold medal. However, he showed great self-restraint and quickly smiled. "Mr. Hades is a genius winemaker like Master Marcus. Our wine naturally can't be compared to yours." "You flatter me." "Is there anything else, Mr. Boris? If not, we will go home first." Meg couldn't be bothered to stand in the cold wind and flatter him. His wife and children were waiting in the carriage. Wouldn't it be nice to go home and sit warm? Boris looked at Meg with a sincere expression and said, "Mr. Hades, you're a very straightforward person. I actually want to invite you to become my business partner. I have 10 large taverns in Rodu, and Mr. Mag is an exceptional brewer. If we can work together, I'm sure we'll be able to create a legend in the wine industry." "Sorry, I am not very interested in creating a legend. If there is, then I am a legend." Meg smiled and stepped onto the carriage to signal the coachman to drive off. Mr. Hades, you can think about it. If you have any ideas, you can find me at Reese's Tavern at any time, Boris said as he stood to the side and looked at the carriage. Meg didn't answer and let the coachman go to Romo Street. He could see that Mr. Boris was an excellent businessman, but he didn't need such a friend. Perhaps he had said the same thing to Ify before, but he didn't know if Ify had agreed to his proposal. That guy just now looked like a scheming person. He didn't seem like a good person, Irina said as she looked at Meg. Businessmen pursue profit. There's no good or bad to speak of. I don't have any intention of becoming friends with him, Meg said with a smile. What about you? I'm not a businessman. I'm a chef. Occasionally, I invest in some industries that are seriously undervalued, Meg said frankly. Will the house prices on Romo Street really rise? They all said that you suffered a loss, Irina said in disbelief. If they could understand it, they would have been rich a long time ago. Meg smiled and said with confidence, there's no need to wait until next year. There will be more people coming to ask about the shops tomorrow. The value of the commercial street was supported by popularity. The gradually declining Romo Street was a low-value area. With Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern winning the double gold award, they would become the twin stars of Romo Street and bring a wave of popularity to Romo Street. With the increase in popularity, the commercial value of Romo Street naturally began to rise. And if other businesses wanted to take advantage of this popularity, they would launch business activities on Romo Street and drive the popularity to rise again. This was a story of mutual achievement. As long as the commercial system of Romo Street could be rebuilt and attract more powerful and unique businesses to move in, a brand new commercial system could be created. And the construction of this commercial system would be supervised by Meg. As the first landlord of Romo Street, he had more than 100 buildings in his hands. He already had this right. A commercial street was like a system. If it wanted to be healthy for a long time, it had to be planned. Homogenization and inferiority would destroy a business district, and it would be doomed to never go far. Meg naturally left such professional matters to the system. If something could be perfectly solved with 10 copper coins, there was no need to exhaust his brain cells and force out an unprofessional business plan. Back at the restaurant, Meg first made a sumptuous lunch. After lunch, he went out to find the young real estate agent who had sold the house to him. Supervisor, there's a man outside who calls himself Hades looking for you. A staff member quickly walked into the office and said to Fitch, who was organizing information. Hades? Fitch raised his head and thought for a while. Suddenly, his eyes widened and showed some surprise. Supervisor, is it someone unsuitable to meet? The staff member saw that Fitch's expression wasn't too good and probed. Should I let him go? Okay. Just say I'm not here. Fitch nodded. Okay. The staff member turned and walked out. Wait. Fitch called out to the staff member who had walked to the door of the office and took a deep breath, saying, Forget it, I'll go myself. Okay. The staff member was a bit confused, but still nodded. Fitch put on his jacket and let out a long sigh before walking out. At the beginning of this month, Fitch, who had been a real estate agent for 3 years, finally welcomed a turning point in his work and became a supervisor. And what made him successful was that he had left a legend in the real estate world. He had sold more than 100 buildings on Romo Street in one go, dealing with the low-quality properties of more than 10 real estate agents in one go, becoming a legend. He had also been promoted and given a raise, becoming a supervisor, and even had his first date with the boss's daughter. And now Mr. Hades, who had made him successful, had actually come knocking on his door. Could it be that he had come to his senses and realized that he had been scammed? Fitch was a bit flustered. Although he had handled the transfer of ownership of more than 100 buildings very cleanly, as Romo Street continued to decline, the value of the old buildings facing the street would only continue to decrease. Mr. Hades, please come in and have a seat. Fitch walked out and saw Hades standing at the door. He hurriedly put on a smile and greeted him. There's no need to go in and have a seat. I'm here today to ask if you accept intermediary services for renting out shops? Meg looked at Fitch and got straight to the point. This young man's work attitude wasn't bad, and his efficiency and business ability were passable. This was also why Meg had chosen him again. Fitch had thought that Mag was going to give him a good scolding, and he faltered slightly upon hearing this. He only came to his senses after a while, and turned to Mag with a surprised expression as he asked, "Mr. Hades, are you planning to rent out all of the shops that you purchased earlier?" "Yes, but I don't want to talk to those people myself, so I'd like to find a professional organization to do this work for me." Meg nodded. "I see." Fitch looked at Meg and couldn't help but feel a little guilty. Mr. Hades had been a respectable person back then, but he had bought so many trashy shops in one go. If Fitch had advised him back then, things wouldn't have turned out this way. Now that he wanted to rent out these shops to recoup some of his losses, it was understandable. However, it was rare to even see a shadow of a person on Romo Street now. Which idiot would spend the money to rent and open a shop? "Mr. Hades, I'm afraid that your shops. Don't you have the service?" Meg interrupted his nonsense. "We have a rental intermediary service. If it's Mr. Hades, I can even give you a discount. I'll only take 5% of the annual rental fee as an intermediary fee." Fitch nodded. He really couldn't bear to see Meg's stubborn look. He could even feel the helplessness and regret. Chapter 2088. Meg used half an hour to convey to Fitch the system's design of the distribution and composition of Romo Street's businesses, as well as the shocking rental prices. Meg then took a look at all the recently listed buildings on Romo Street and bought another 30 or so buildings. "Mr. Hades, you are truly a god." Fitch had mixed feelings as he watched Meg sign the contract so readily. Although he'd earned another few $100,000 in brokerage fees, he felt a sense of guilt as he watched Meg sink deeper and deeper into the abyss. As for the business plan Hades had mentioned earlier, it was a completely imaginative idea that was several times higher than the average rental price on Romo Street. "Make a trip to Romo Street in the afternoon and leave your contact information on my vacant apartment. Someone should be looking for you soon," Meg said with a smile. "All right, that's part of my job. I'll immediately bring someone over once I've sorted out the information." Fitch nodded with a smile. A straightforward customer like Hades was probably the favorite of every salesperson. Today's transaction volume for 33 buildings had exceeded his expectations for his first month as a supervisor. He wondered if he'd be able to have dinner with the boss's daughter tonight, or if he'd be able to take some other steps forward. Meg could tell what Fitch was thinking, but the other party's attitude was friendly, and his business skills weren't bad either. He was worth cooperating with, and didn't care about anything else. Fitch saw Meg out the door and arranged for the store's carriage to take him home. Mag sat in the horse-drawn carriage and stretched his back comfortably. At such a young age, he was going to live a life of collecting rent every month and become the most handsome landlord on this street. The lives of the rich were just this dull and boring. "Supervisor, you're truly a god. You've sold 33 buildings in one go." The employee who'd come in earlier looked at Fitch with admiration. "It's a routine operation." Fitch placed the information in his hands on the table with an indifferent expression. "Sort out this information, and then come with me to Romo Street." "All right." He picked up the documents on the table and asked curiously, "Why are you going to Romo Street? Didn't you sell all the houses there?" "The buyer asked us to help rent out these houses, so we're going to put up rental notices," Fitch said. "Are there still people renting shops in that place?" That person was a little confused, but he still took the information and returned to his seat. Not long after, Fitch led his subordinates down to Romo Street. The streets were still deserted, and there were only a few pedestrians. The scattered shops were also in a half-closed state, and many of them were pasted with transfer notices. "I think it won't be long before there are no more shops on this street," the subordinate whispered as he glanced at the tavern next door. Fei Chi also sighed in his heart. Romo Street also had its glory days. However, he quickly withdrew his gaze and stuffed the glue bucket in his hand into his subordinate's hand. "Take the money and do the work. Hurry up and put up the notice. We have to put it up on over 100 buildings this afternoon." "Supervisor, what kind of family does that boss have? He bought over 100 buildings just like that. No matter how cheap it is, it's still 200 million copper coins. Is he really that rich?" The subordinate couldn't help but ask curiously as he worked. "If he says he's from an ordinary family, Would you believe him? Fitch glanced at him. We can't say we don't believe him, right? The subordinate shrugged his shoulders. Then hurry up and put it up. The weather is so cold. Isn't it comfortable to go back and warm up? Fitch rolled his eyes. He also carried the glue bucket in one hand and pasted the notice on the door with the other. Romo Street wasn't large, and most of the houses were old. However, these houses could all be demolished and rebuilt. This wasn't a difficult matter for construction teams with cultivators. It was even cheaper than renovating old buildings. However, Fitch didn't feel that there would be any idiot who would come here to rent a house and do a business that was clearly losing money. Unless another Mr. Hades came. "Excuse me, is this house for rent?" A voice rang out from behind Fei Qi and the others. Fitch turned around and saw two well-dressed middle-aged men standing behind them. "Yes, sir. This building is for rent. It's not just this one. There are over 100 other buildings on this street that are available for rent." Fitch showed a professional smile and nodded. "Over 100 buildings, they're all yours?" The tall and thin middle-aged man on the left said with some surprise. "No, we're just agents responsible for renting out the buildings for the owners." Fitch shook his head and sized up the two with a reserved gaze. Judging from their clothes, these two were rich and upper-class people. Could it be that he had really met a sucker again? Wasn't his luck a little too good? "Agents, huh?" The two came to a realization. "How big is this building, and how much is the annual rent?" The short and fat one asked. Fitch flipped through the information Meg gave him in the morning and quickly found the serial number of this building. He answered, "This building has a single floor area of 200 square meters, 3 floors above ground, and an underground cellar. The first year's rent is 200,000 copper coins." 200,000 copper coins? Isn't that a little too expensive with this location and the flow of people? The middle-aged man frowned, clearly dissatisfied with this price. "This is the price that the owner requested. We have no right to change it." Fitch smiled wryly. He'd already mentioned this to Meg before, but he'd insisted on this price. "But look at this building. It's a very new building on Romo Street, and the internal structure is still very intact. It used to be a tavern, so there are many things left that can be used directly. If it wasn't on Romo Street, the price would be much higher on any other street." Fitch promoted enthusiastically. "If it wasn't on Romo Street, there wouldn't be such a cheap store. But it's also because of Romo Street that it shouldn't be priced like this." The tall and thin middle-aged man shook his head with a smile and pointed at the tavern with a sign for sale, hanging not far away. "Then the tavern's transfer fee plus 1 year's rent is only 200,000 copper coins. Wouldn't it be better to just take over and be able to operate?" "That would indeed be a better choice." Fitch nodded frankly. These two were clearly smart businessmen. The short and fat middle-aged man looked around and said to Fitch, "You're the middleman. Then do you know if there are any stores for sale on Romo Street?" "Stores?" Fitch and his subordinates both looked surprised. It was already strange enough that these two smart businessmen wanted to rent stores on Romo Street, but now they were asking about stores for sale. Could they really be two idiots? However, all the buildings on Romo Street that were intended for sale had already been bought by Mr. Hades. The 33 buildings today were the last batch. The remaining buildings were basically for personal use or rent and had no intention of being sold. "My apologies. The last 33 buildings have already been bought today. There shouldn't be any stores for sale on Romo Street at the moment." Fitch shook his head. Chapter 2089.
What?
The two middle-aged men looked surprised. Were they all bought? All of them? The short and stout middle-aged man stared at Fitch.
Yes.
Fitch nodded, not understanding why the two had such a reaction. "Alas, we're still too late." The tall and thin middle-aged man patted his thigh with a regretful expression. "I didn't expect that someone would come earlier than us. We shouldn't have eaten that lunch." The short and stout middle-aged man was also regretful. Fitch and his men looked puzzled. They looked at each other and shook their heads. "So, the one who commissioned you to rent out more than 100 buildings is the buyer, right? Can you tell us who he is?" The tall and thin middle-aged man looked at Fitch and asked. Fitch shook his head and said apologetically, "Sorry, this is the customer's privacy. We can't disclose it." The two middle-aged men looked at each other and saw pity in each other's eyes. Fitch looked at the two and asked somewhat curiously, "I'm a little curious. Why are the two gentlemen suddenly so interested in the shops on Romo Street? After all, as you said, Romo Street isn't very popular." "Since there are no more shops to buy, I might as well tell you the truth. In today's wine tasting conference, Romo Street's Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern both took home gold medals. Moreover, they were both gold medal wines with full marks." The short and stout middle-aged man said somewhat ruefully, "You can ignore the current Romo Street, but in the future, Romo Street will be beyond your reach."
"What?"
"Double gold medal." Fitch and his men stared with wide eyes. As a qualified salesman, Fitch was very clear about the principle of a commercial street's popularity gathering. He hadn't seen the grand occasion of Romo Street, but he had heard his seniors mention it many times. Romo Street had quietly risen by relying on Titan Tavern's gold medal and had been prosperous for more than a decade. It was precisely because Titan Tavern lost Marcus and was reduced to an ordinary tavern that Romo Street began to go downhill and finally became what it was today. But today, Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern both took home the gold medal of the wine tasting conference. It could be imagined what kind of popularity these two taverns would bring to Romo Street. It wasn't impossible for Romo Street to return to its peak, or even create an even greater glory. And Saipan Tavern. Wasn't that Mr. Hades' tavern? Fitch gulped as he saw the same type of shock in the eyes of his subordinates.
He suddenly thought of a terrible thing.
From the beginning, when Mr. Hades took a fancy to Romo Street and bought more than 100 buildings in one go, he had already planned to use the Saipan Tavern as an anchor to restore Romo Street to its former glory. Today, the Saipan Tavern won the Gold Award, so he was ready to rent out the shop. He also set many restrictions, and the rent was much higher than the market price. This was not a rent that was much higher than the market price. It was a very reasonable rent. Moreover, Mr. Hades had bought the last 33 buildings, which meant that he controlled more than half of the high-quality shops on Romo Street. This street would be called Hades Street in the future, and probably no one would be able to vote against it. One could imagine the value of the 100-plus buildings in Mr. Hades' hands when Romo Street returned to its peak. Mr. Hades is truly a godly man. Fei Qi was incomparably shocked. While he was still feeling complacent about the $2 million intermediary fee, the other was already considering a business that was worth several $100 million. This was probably the difference in perspective. The two middle-aged men turned back to the tavern that was about to be sold. Fitch's words made them determined to buy the tavern today. Otherwise, when the news spread, it would be even more difficult to find such a low-priced property. "Supervisor, could all of this be part of Mr. Hades' plan?" The subordinate gulped as he looked at Fei Qi and asked, "If it was only the Titan Tavern that won the Gold Award, I might think it was luck." Fei Qi waved the proposal in his hand and smiled wryly, but the Saipan Tavern also won the Gold Award, and Mr. Hades even gave me such a complete proposal. This already explains everything. This time, he must have made a lot of money, right? The tavern street in the north of the city is now worth around $5 million. Fei Qi tried to make his expression not so sour. "Hiss." The subordinate sucked in a breath of cold air and said sourly, "Then the owners who sold their houses today will probably cry themselves to death." Fei Qi smiled. "There's nothing to say about this. Mr. Hades earned this money with his own ability. If it wasn't for him settling down in Romo Street, the commercial value of this street would have already hit rock bottom. He would have become the new founder of this street." "That's true. Truly admirable." The subordinate nodded in agreement. In their hearts, Meg had already risen from a sucker to a business magnate. "Hurry up and put up the announcement. In the next month, just renting out these shops will be enough to fill up next month's sales." Fei Qi urged with a smile. "Alrighty," the subordinate responded, full of enthusiasm. When they passed by the Saipan Tavern, the two stopped to look around for a while before leaving in amazement. The news that the Saipan Tavern and the Titan Tavern both won the Gold Award at the wine tasting conference also spread like wildfire on Romo Street. The owners who stayed behind on Romo Street didn't believe it at first, but after confirming it, many of them cried tears of joy. The glory of Romo Street back then was still vivid in their minds. Just when everyone was about to give up, this double gold award was like rain after a long drought, and instantly gave the owners who were about to give up a shot in the arm. Back then, the Titan Tavern alone propped up the entire street. Now, there was another Saipan Tavern. Everyone could see the future of Romo Street. The waiter ran into the tavern and whispered a few words into the tavern owner's ear. The owner was discussing the transfer of the tavern with two middle-aged men and was struggling over the final price of 1 or 200 copper coins. The tavern owner was shocked and asked the waiter, "Really?" The waiter nodded with certainty and said, "That's what everyone is saying. It has already spread throughout Rodu, so it can't be fake." The two middle-aged men looked at each other and both cursed in their hearts. "Let's go with the price you said. Let's sign the contract," the short and fat middle-aged man urged. The tavern owner shook his head with a smile and said, "Wait, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to transfer this tavern." The tall and thin middle-aged man furrowed his brows and said, "We've already discussed to this extent. Isn't it a little inappropriate for you to back out now? Those two owners are hiding the news and trying to take over my tavern at a low price. Isn't it a little inappropriate?" The tavern owner's smile faded, and he chuckled coldly as he said, "I didn't attend the wine tasting conference today, so I don't know about the Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern, but you can't take me for a fool. Forget it. Let's go look for other shops." The short and fat middle-aged man sighed and got up to walk out of the tavern. The tall and thin middle-aged man could only get up and leave. After the two of them left, the tavern owner said to the waiter, "Quick, go and take down the sign outside and then contact a renovation team to close the tavern for 3 days and renovate it." So sudden? The waiter was a little stunned. The tavern owner, who was still having a headache over the transfer of the tavern, was now rejecting the transfer request and even wanted to renovate the tavern. "Nonsense. If it's too late, we'll have made a lot of money." The tavern owner pushed the waiter out of the tavern and took down the sign on the door. He didn't forget to remind the waiter, "Go and find the construction team today, and we'll start work tonight. The earlier it's finished, the better. You can even pay more."
Oh, okay.
The waiter left with his stomach full of confusion. The same situation was happening everywhere on Romo Street. The shops that originally had the sign for transfer all took down the sign one after another. And those dilapidated and dirty shops started to clean up one after another, or directly chose to close their doors and renovate. These shops that had gathered because of the Titan Tavern were indeed a little outdated. The lack of popularity led to a lack of motivation to renovate. Now, taking advantage of the popularity of the Double Gold Award, the owners also had the idea of upgrading their shops. "Miss, now everyone knows that we won the Gold Award, and many people have come to congratulate us." Mara excitedly ran into the winery and said to F, who was seriously operating the machine in front of her. F closed the machine and looked at Mara. "Don't run around if you have nothing to do. Go outside and keep an eye on the construction team. Our renovation and expansion must be done well. The Titan Tavern in the future will be different from before."
Oh.
Mara nodded and turned to walk out a few steps. Then she turned back and looked at F with confusion. "But miss, why didn't you accept Mr. Boris's invitation? This way, not only can you have many taverns, but you can also call them Titan Tavern. You don't have to work hard to make wine every day, and you can sleep in every day. Your little head only knows how to sleep every day, and you don't know anything else." F unhappily tapped her forehead. Looking at the winery, she smiled and said, "I don't want so many taverns. I only want this one that my father and mother left for me. Also, I like to make wine, and I want to truly inherit my father's business and make authentic Titan wine. This is what will make me happy."
Oh.
Mara nodded as if she didn't understand. "Go, get to work." F waved her hand and chased Mara out of the winery. When Boris talked to her today, he did indeed give her a very sincere offer. She would become a partner of the Boris Tavern, 30% of the shares, and earn tens of millions of dividends a year. Furthermore, she would be able to retain full ownership of the Titan Tavern. However, he also gave her a condition that she couldn't accept, and that was to share the cellar and brewing method of the Titan wine. Hence, F rejected Boris's offer of partnership, even though he said that he was good friends with her father. Now, she only wanted to manage the Titan Tavern well and make it one of the best taverns in Rodu, just like it used to be. The cellar could only supply about 50 bottles of Titan wine a day, so she had to brew more Titan wine and sell it according to the year to attract more customers. She didn't want to just rely on her father's savings. Meg also received many congratulations from his neighbors, and he also expressed his thanks in a friendly manner. Neighbors should take care of each other. As for the renovation plans of these bosses, he was very supportive. One of the main reasons why Romo Street lost its competitiveness was that the businesses on the entire street looked too old and outdated. Customers liked the new and hated the old. Apart from those old shops that focused on taste as their core competitiveness, people preferred shops that looked new, even if it was only the shop's renovation that looked new. Father, these neighbors are so nice. The table in front of Amy was filled with all kinds of food, all of which were given by the neighbors who came to congratulate them. Everyone knew that the tavern owner had a pair of cute daughters, so they mostly gave some snacks and small toys. Yes, it's rare to see such passionate neighbors nowadays. Meg nodded with a smile. Saipan Tavern had won a gold medal, and these neighbors were the true stakeholders, so this kind of enthusiasm was understandable. What made him happier was that after the wine tasting conference in the morning, the popularity of the Titan Tavern had successfully exceeded 1,000, reaching 2,122. And this number was still steadily rising. With the strength of word of mouth and the endorsement of the wine tasting conference, even the customers who didn't taste the Saipan Tavern personally became fans of the Saipan Tavern. I was right to attend this wine tasting conference. Meg nodded with satisfaction.
Ding.
Congratulations to the host for completing the stage mission. The restaurant's popularity has exceeded 1,000. Received reward, a spicy field snail recipe. The system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. Sucking screws. Meg raised his eyebrows slightly. This was probably a challenge for the people of the other world. This kind of skill, even many foodies in China didn't master it and could only rely on external help like toothpicks. And a man who could suck screws was said to have a higher level of spouse rights. Of course, Meg didn't understand these words, and it was only hearsay. Spicy field snail was a traditional dish that went with wine, and as a reward, it was a small surprise. Meg was very good at sucking field snails and was also very popular with girls. This was true. Because Saipan Tavern's Mao Tai won the gold medal of the wine tasting conference, Meg gave himself a day off to celebrate. A notice was hung at the door, and Meg glanced at the Titan Tavern that was being renovated overnight. When the drunkards who heard the news saw this scene, they would probably cry. Amy and we're going out for a while, and we'll be back later. Stay at home and play on the second floor. Don't go out, okay? Meg locked the door from the inside and looked at Amy and Anne, who were holding a gift bag of snacks that had just been extracted from the wishing well. Are you going to beat up the bad guy? Amy asked. Yes, we're going to maintain world peace. Meg smiled and nodded. Amy's eyes lit up, and she looked at him expectantly. Can you bring me along? I'm also very good at fighting. Meg patted her little head and said, Not this time. That bad guy is very dangerous. When Amy grows up and becomes stronger, you can go.
Okay.
Amy nodded obediently and didn't insist. Remember, no matter who comes, don't open the door. The door is locked from the inside, and no one can come in. Meg reminded again and watched the two children go upstairs before stepping into the teleportation portal with Irina. The tavern had a level 9 defense strengthened by the system, and Irina had set up a defensive formation. As long as it wasn't attacked by many level 10 powerhouses, it would be able to hold out until they returned. Meg just received a letter from Melanie, saying that they found an abnormal location in the north, and asked him to go check it out. Meg naturally didn't dare to delay since it was related to the Great Old One. and Irina took the initiative to ask to go together. Chapter 2090. To the north of the Roth Empire, there was an endless snowfield. This place was covered in snow all year round, and there was almost no sign of life when one went deeper into the snowfield. No one knew how far north it was because the further north one went, the lower the temperature would be. Furthermore, there would be blizzards and storms. Even 10th-tier giant dragons wouldn't be able to pass through those obstacles. There were even cases of 10th-tier giant dragons getting lost in the snowfield. Because of that, this snowfield had become a forbidden area that all the races wouldn't set foot in. At this moment, Noah was waving a piece of red cloth to guide the purple-striped griffin in the sky to land at a fault in an ice cliff that was more than 250 kilometers deep into the school. "Mr. Mack, did you bring food?" Noah asked shamelessly when the griffin had just landed. Meg looked at Noah, whose nose was red from the cold and whose eyebrows were covered in frost. He smiled and took out a ball of mud and a small cup that was still steaming. "Wow. Buddha jumps over the wall and beggar's chicken." Noah's eyes widened as he swallowed his saliva. After staying in this snowfield for a few days, he had been eating frozen pancakes that had to be roasted over fire to bite into. He still felt the bone-chilling cold when he slept beside the fire at night. It was a life worse than death. When he suddenly saw the steaming Buddha jumps over the wall and the beggar's chicken, Noah was about to cry when he opened the lid. "Mr. Mack, you are my second parent," Noah said to Meg with tears in his eyes as he took a bite of the beggar's chicken.
No, no, no.
"I don't have a son like you. Amy will despise you." Meg quickly rejected him as he looked at the cave entrance on the ice cliff. "Mr. Mack, you are here?" Melander walked out of the cave quickly.
Yes.
"What's the situation here?" Melander suddenly called him to this place, but it didn't look conspicuous.
Follow me in.
"I will tell you as we walk." Melander led Meg and Irina into the cave. "Grandpa, aren't you going to eat some beggar's chicken and Buddha jumps over the wall before working?" Noah's voice sounded from behind. "Go ahead, I'm not hungry." Then he said to Meg and the others, "We discovered this ice cave this morning. The tortoiseshell stone reacted, and we only found this cave after searching for a long time." "Josh has been here before?" Meg frowned. "I'm not sure yet, but this ice cave is very strange. You'll know when you get in." Melanie didn't say much, but he quickened his pace. After passing through a long ice path, the road ahead suddenly opened up. A huge ice cave appeared in their line of sight, and their position was in the middle of the ice cave. Meg's eyes lit up. He didn't expect there to be another world under the ice. "Look below." Melanie walked to the edge of the ice cliff and pointed down. Mag and Irina poked their heads out to take a look, and their expressions changed. Below the ice cave was a huge ice surface. On the ice surface, there were countless human-shaped and beast-shaped holes. It was as if someone had dug out something from the ice. Some broken bones and body parts were scattered in the holes. There were signs that they had been eaten recently. A strange aura shrouded the ice cave. "This is..." Meg frowned and felt a chill on his back. Melanie pondered and said, "I once read an ancient book. It said that in ancient times, the snowy plains in the north were an ancient battlefield. Many races fought here and left many corpses. These corpses were buried in ice and snow. Many of them were perfectly preserved because they were frozen. People have been finding ancient corpses on the snowy plains. There are many mysterious ancient corpses whose races cannot be identified. If I'm not wrong, this should be an ancient battlefield. There are many ancient corpses buried here." "What about the ancient corpses?" Meg suddenly felt uneasy. "The ancient corpses have disappeared. Judging from the traces, it happened not too long ago," Melanie said with a serious expression. "They should have been controlled. There are remnants of demonic aura." "It has something to do with demons," Irina said. She raised her hand and shot out a beam of golden holy light. It reacted violently with the remnants of black demonic aura on the stone wall. Meg was silent for a while. He looked at Melanie and said, "In other words, Josh could have controlled the ancient corpses here and turned them into servants that he could order around. Yes. If it was just to absorb resentment, there wouldn't be these holes and gnawed corpses left. Melanti nodded. I'm very familiar with the method of controlling corpses. However, he used a more advanced method. It's similar to bewitchment. But they have been dead for countless years. All that's left are corpses that have been slowed down by the ice and snow. How can he bewitch them? Meg was puzzled. As long as the resentment doesn't dissipate, he can do it. That's why demons are so scary. Melanti shook his head slightly and frankly said, even us ghosts can do it through some methods. Irina retracted her hand and coldly said, instead of absorbing resentment, he chose to control these corpses. What is Josh trying to do? When the various races of the Norland continent put aside their differences and decided to join forces to deal with the demons, what he needed was sufficient strength and numbers of helpers. Meg looked at the densely packed corpses below with a complicated expression and said, these corpses will form a powerful undead army that will follow him to conquer the Norland continent. If that's the case, I'm afraid there are many more ice caves like this in the northern snowfield. Countless ancient corpses that died in battle are buried under the snowfield, Melanti said in a low voice. Save me, Grandpa, there's a ghost. Right at this moment, a shrill voice sounded from the cave. Noah was running over with the Buddha jumps over the walls in his arms and a drumstick in his mouth. Dense footsteps sounded behind him. At the same time, the ice walls in all directions of the ice cave suddenly exploded. Ancient corpses jumped out from the ice walls and pounced on Meg and the rest. Countless ancient corpses also crawled out from underground and roared as they climbed up the ice walls. There were thousands of them. Most of these ancient corpses had strange appearances. There were three-headed humanoid beasts, human-faced spiders, giants with only half a head left, monsters with green fur all over their bodies. Their bodies were incomplete, and they did not belong to the races that existed now. The similarity was that their eyes were glowing with a faint red light, and they were rushing toward Meg and the rest in a frenzy. Seems like this is a trap. He knew we were coming from the start. Meg pointed his finger forward, and the Tian-Du sword turned into an afterimage as it shot into the eerie tunnel, killing all the ancient corpses that were rushing toward them. We have to leave from here. The terrain is not in our favor. Irina raised her magic caster's staff, and the light from her staff shone, and the ancient corpses that were pouncing toward her were instantly turned into ashes. However, these ancient corpses seemed to be endless. After a batch was destroyed by the holy light, they continued to surge out from underground and the walls, and almost covered the entire wall of the cave. A teleportation talisman appeared in Irina's hand, and she lit it up on her fingertips. A golden light flashed under everyone's feet, but it was annihilated by a black demonic aura that suddenly appeared. Chapter 2091. The teleportation spell failed, and the four of them were left where they were. It's an anti-magic array formation. It seems like he prepared a lot in order to keep us here. Irina frowned and raised her hand to conjure up a magic barrier, blocking the attacks of the ancient corpses outside the barrier. Follow me. Let's leave this place first. Meg pressed the SOS button in his pocket, and the long sword flew back into his hand. He rushed toward the cave that they came from. Countless ancient corpses swarmed in from outside the cave, but they were no match for the Tian-Du sword. They forced their way through. Melander protected Noah, who was hugging the Buddha jumps over the wall, and followed behind Meg to deal with the ancient corpses that suddenly appeared from the cliff. Irina brought up the rear with her law enforcer staff. The holy light was like a divine weapon in the narrow tunnel. It swept through everything without any pressure. However, Meg and the rest had only rushed halfway when the cave started to shake violently and then collapsed. Pass from above. Mag shouted in a deep voice. He and his sword became one as they spun upward. The 10,000-year black ice turned into ice chips like tofu under the Tian-Du sword. A tunnel that was about the width of a person was forced open. Not long after, light shone through the ice.
Bam!
A huge hole appeared in the ice field. Meg broke out of the ice with a Tion-Du sword in his hand. However, before Meg could heave a sigh of relief, a black shadow rushed toward him. Meg instinctively raised his sword and slashed out.
Ding!
The sound of metal clashing against stone was ear-piercing. Meg only felt as if he was hit by a speeding train. His body flew backward uncontrollably. He twisted in midair, and his long sword stabbed into the ice. However, he still flew backward for about 100 meters before he could stabilize himself. The black figure had already charged towards him once again. The black spear was suffused with a dim light, and the black armor was new. The resolute face was expressionless, and the gaze was somewhat stupefied as it suffused with a dim red light. Meg stood up with his sword. He looked at that familiar face with a complicated expression. The disappeared Rankster. Meg didn't expect to meet him here. Rankster appeared in front of him in an instant and engaged him in close combat. Meg, who was on guard, was no longer in such a sorry state. However, he still retreated a dozen meters. Rankster was also sent flying by the sword. His spear stabbed into the ground, and he stopped after retreating a dozen meters. So powerful! Noah exclaimed. Melander and Irina were also shocked. There was no doubt that Meg's strength had exceeded the limits of level 10. Although he was not a god, level 10 could not be compared to him. Rankster, on the other hand, was able to fight on par with Meg and not be at a disadvantage in the battle. It was evident how strong he was.
Bang! Bang! Bang!
At the same time, the ice surface shattered, and ancient corpses crawled out one after another. They were densely packed, as if they had covered the entire snowfield. Once again, they rushed towards Melander and the others. Meg blew a long whistle. Roar! Ozzy flew over from the distance and spat out a ball of lightning. It swept through the ancient corpses and flew towards Irina and the others. Rankster stared at the purple-striped griffin. He raised his spear and aimed it at Ozzy. "Your opponent is me," Meg shouted. With a wave of his hand, the Tion-Du sword had already turned into a stream of light and flew towards Rankster, piercing straight towards his heart. Rankster retracted his gaze instantly. He retracted his spear and swept it towards the Tion-Du sword that was flying towards him. The sword was sent flying, but Meg caught it and rushed towards Rankster again. The two of them were already fighting in close quarters. "Get up!" Irina tossed Noah onto the purple-striped griffin before jumping onto the griffin's back with Melanti. The purple-striped griffin quickly rose into the air and narrowly avoided the half-headed giant's stone axe. At the same time, it spat out a string of lightning balls, blasting the giant into pieces. "Why are there so many of these darn things?" Noah's voice trembled as he looked at the densely packed ancient corpses on the snowfield. Even sitting on the griffin's back, he could not see the end of them. There were probably more than 100,000 of them. "I'm afraid Josh has already met up with the devils that escaped from the seal," Irina said with a frown. "Once these ancient corpses head south, the Norland continent will face a terrifying catastrophe." Melander's voice was also trembling. "Let's get rid of the surrounding ancient corpses first to reduce the pressure on him." Irina quickly retracted her gaze. She chanted a magic spell and used the holy light technique to sweep away the ancient corpses that were trying to get close to Meg. Melander grabbed a handful of black beans from his waist pocket and scattered them down. After they landed, they turned into black ghost-faced swordsmen and charged towards the ancient corpses fearlessly. Noah hugged the Buddha jumps over the wall and became a useless person who was shouting 666 the whole time. The peak close combat between Meg and Rankster was already not something they could participate in or control. There was no fancy sword aura, nor was there any battle aura. The battle between the two of them had already returned to the essence of a battle. It was a battle between a peak swordsman and a peak gunner. Every blow was filled with killing intent. Their surroundings looked calm, but there were countless spatial rifts that had been cut open. The ancient corpses that barged in were directly cut into pieces. Back then, when Alex was at the peak of his power, he met the only opponent who could match him, Rankster. Meg didn't expect to meet Rankster again after he broke through the 10th tier shackles. He was still evenly matched with him. It was just that this top powerhouse had already lost his mind and became a valiant general under the control of the Great Old Ones. Meg's emotions were more or less a little complicated. There was the sigh of appreciation for each other and also the pity for Elizabeth. She had been looking for Rankster all this time, following in his footsteps, but to no avail. He wondered how she would feel if she saw Rankster's current state. Rankster! Rankster! Meg shouted at Rankster and tried to communicate with him. Rankster's red eyes seemed to flicker slightly, but he quickly fell into an even more frenzied state and launched an even more intense attack on Meg. Meg's eyes lit up. Rankster seemed to still have a little consciousness and wasn't completely under his control. He continued to call out to him as he blocked Rankster's attacks. However, other than making him even crazier, there wasn't any obvious effect. Rankster, Elizabeth has been looking for you all this time. Do you want her to see you like this? Meg shouted. Rankster's forward movement paused, and a struggling expression appeared on his face. His eyes also switched between blue and red. It's effective. Meg's face lit up, and he continued. For Elizabeth. For the Frost Dragon tribe. You must wake up. You are Rankster, the king of the Frost Dragon tribe, Elizabeth's father. You are not the devil.
Li.
Shah. Rankster muttered a few words with a pained expression. Then, he fell into a frenzied state again and attacked Meg. Meg looked at the red-eyed Rankster and used the corner of his eye to look at the sky as he blocked the attacks. He obviously couldn't wake Rankster up, but the Ancient Ones might have a way. He could only hope that she could see his distress signal and come as soon as possible. What is that? Noah, who was sitting on the griffin, pointed to the north and exclaimed before she arrived. The ice started to tremble violently, and a gelatinous thing that was as big as a hill and covered in scales slowly crawled out from under the ice. It raised its huge bat wings and covered the sky. Chapter 2092. A huge, indescribable object rose slowly from the ice. The sky turned black, and countless dark clouds gathered. A terrifying aura spread, and even the purple-striped griffin was trembling slightly. Its gelatinous body, which was covered in black scales, kept changing its shape like a huge worm. Just one look at it was enough to make one feel terrified. After the huge bat wings were raised, it was at least a few thousand meters tall. Its huge body was still incomparably huge in this boundless snowfield. However, it didn't seem to have a head and only had a huge body, which made it even more eerie. It's Cthulhu, Melander said with a trembling voice. There was deep fear in his eyes. Seems like this is the one that escaped from the Dragon Island. Irina's expression also became very serious as she held a few disposable talismans in her hand. Cthulhu's power was undeniable. In the seal outside Chaos City, tens of 10th-tier powerhouses couldn't do anything to it even if they joined forces. Meanwhile, Meg, who could barely delay it, was being held back by Rankster, who was equally powerful. Without the seal as a shield, even if the three of them joined forces, they wouldn't be a match for this fellow. Cthulhu's appearance made the ancient corpses even crazier. Tens of ancient corpses that could fly rose into the air and formed a formation as they flew towards Irina and the rest. Cthulhu let out a disgusting sound and then wriggled towards Meg. Along the way, the glacier shattered. The struggle in Rankster's eyes had disappeared and was replaced by a sea of red. His power seemed to have been strengthened, and he attacked Meg crazily. You guys go first. Meg shouted at Irina and the rest as he retreated. Meg's heart was heavy. He didn't expect to meet Cthulhu when he was just investigating an ice cave. Or rather, this was a trap that Cthulhu had set for them to jump into. He was far from being a match for Cthulhu now. Even if he fought Rankster, he would only have a 50% chance of winning. The problem he had to consider now is how to escape and avoid being controlled by Cthulhu and becoming a puppet like Rankster. Violet, go get him. Irina raised her magic caster staff and chanted loudly, "O holy light, Destroy all evil. Dazzling holy light swept out, and dozens of ancient flying corpses were instantly turned into ashes. The sky was cleared. Roar. The purple-striped griffin let out a long screech and spat out a ball of lightning from its mouth. Then, it flew towards Meg. At this moment, Cthulhu suddenly turned towards them and flapped its wings. Countless black whirlwinds appeared out of thin air, tearing through space and blocking the purple-striped griffin's path of advance. Moreover, the whirlwinds also began to surround it. Whoosh! The black whirlwind tore through the tough scales of the purple-striped griffin like a sharp blade. Just by touching it, it tore open a huge bloody wound on its body. The purple-striped griffin felt the pain and hurriedly pulled back, avoiding the black hurricane that had almost formed a wall. Go around them, Irina ordered calmly as she cast healing magic on Ozzy. Ozzy turned into a purple lightning bolt and, once again, charged towards Meg from the side. However, it was still blocked by the hurricane and could not break through. We have to leave immediately. When he really attacks us, we won't be able to leave, Melander said in a low voice as he used the phantom blade to kill a few ancient corpses that had appeared behind them. Noah hugged the Buddha jumps over the wall and was completely in a daze. He had become a salted fish that had even forgotten to shout 666. No matter what, we have to bring him along. Irina looked at Cthulhu that was wriggling towards Meg and closed her eyes. Irina's body slowly rose and floated in the air. The golden red between her eyebrows began to glow, and a small golden tree pattern appeared in the red. It looked just like the Tree of Life. A light green beam of light flew down from the sky and landed on her forehead. Irina opened her eyes, and her aura began to rise. Grandpa, why do I feel that she has become a little different? Noah came back to his senses and looked at Irina, who was floating in the air in astonishment. She's borrowing the power of God. Melander looked at Irina and was also surprised. God of light, please grant me the power to eliminate this evil existence and cleanse all filth and sin. Irina raised the magic caster staff in her hand. A crack suddenly appeared in the dark sky, and a golden light landed on Irina's body and illuminated her. Irina's aura rose again, and her entire body was enveloped by the golden holy light. She was like a deity that no one dared to look directly at. Cthulhu's huge body gradually stopped and then turned to face Irina. There were spots of red light on its body that were covered in scales, and they were staring at Irina like eyes. Holy light, judge this evil. Let everything return to peace. Irina pointed her magic caster staff at Cthulhu, and a huge ray of holy light gushed out and collided with Cthulhu. The collision between the black demonic aura and the holy light made a teeth-numbing sound of corrosion. Cthulhu's body was enveloped by the holy light, and it began to tremble slightly. It's effective, Noah exclaimed in surprise. Melander did not appear too optimistic, and instead said to the purple-striped griffin, "We'd better back off and take this opportunity to go around the hurricane." The purple-striped griffin understood his words and suddenly swooped down, almost sticking close to the ground as it found a gap in the hurricane and rushed towards Meg. Kiki, Cthulhu made a sound like glass being broken. Black demonic aura suddenly surged out of its body and rolled out, extinguishing the holy light that was enveloping it. Its huge bat wings flapped slowly, and its huge body was lifted off the ground. Its body wriggled, and a black tentacle formed from its abdomen and pierced towards Irina, who was suspended in midair. Oh no! Meg slashed Ringster away with his sword, and his expression changed drastically when he saw that tentacle piercing towards Irina. Under Ringster's entanglement, he was completely unable to block this attack for Irina at this moment. And Irina seemed to have used a power that did not belong to her to unleash that attack, and was still in that state. Get lost. Meg's eyes were red as he sent Ringster flying with his sword, and then used all his strength to throw the Tian-Du sword out. Swoosh! The Tian-Du sword turned into a ray of light and flew towards the tentacle that was piercing towards Irina like a spear. It was too late. Meg's heart had already dropped to the freezing point. Cthulhu's speed was faster than his, and he could not cut off the tentacle before it pierced Irina. The golden light in Irina's eyes gradually dissipated, and then she saw the tentacle that was already in front of her. Right at this moment, a silver light tore through space and instantly pierced through the tip of that tentacle. At the same time, a gunshot pierced through the sky. Chapter 2093. Irina, who thought that she would not be able to escape death, was still in a daze when a light shield rose around her body and blocked the green liquid that splattered everywhere. "It's she." Meg's eyes lit up. Seeing that Irina was safe and sound, his heavy heart was instantly relieved. With a wave of his hand, the long sword returned to his hand. In this world, it was his first time hearing such a beautiful gunshot. It was a precise and clean shot that perfectly matched the feeling that she gave him. A 5-star battleship appeared in the void. The giant railgun at the front of the battleship was rapidly charging at Cthulhu. The 3 main cannons were also aimed at Cthulhu. "What is that?" Noah slowly stood up and looked at the giant steel battleship floating in the air in disbelief. "No matter what it is, the good news is that it is at least on our side." Melanti also swallowed and said softly,
"Boom, boom, boom."
The giant cannon began to roar. The giant cannonball pushed by the railgun crashed into Cthulhu that was floating in the air. Its mountain-like body was pushed back a lot before it exploded. The terrifying explosion wave turned all the ancient corpses within a few hundred meters into ashes. The purple-striped griffin had already turned around and flew out, but it was still pushed back 1,000 meters by the aftermath of the explosion. What terrifying power! This giant steel beast is actually so terrifying. Noah was in a daze. Meg also retreated with his sword. This was a concentrated bombardment from a star battleship of an advanced civilization. He did not want to be caught in the crossfire. In just a few seconds, a round of bombardment was completed. The mountain-like Cthulhu was blown 1,000 meters away. Its body was charred black and there were many holes on its bat wings. The ancient corpses within 1,000 meters were also turned into charred skeletons. Goo 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 goo. Cthulhu let out a series of incomprehensible roars at the giant battleship. It activated the ancient corpses to attack the giant battleship and Meg's group again. Tens of thousands of ancient corpses rushed over and almost piled up together. Cthulhu flapped its wings and soared into the sky. The holes on its wings were quickly mended, and in the blink of an eye, it was as good as new. It flew toward the battleship as well. "Come up. We can't kill him. Let's leave this place first." She's cold voice rang in Meg's ears. A passage was opened in the cabin. Go in through the tunnel." Meg jumped onto the purple-striped griffin that flew to his side. He then approached Irina, grabbed her waist, and plunged into the passageway of the 5-star warship. The fully charged arrowhead cannon fired another electromagnetic cannon at Cthulhu. At the same time, it dropped several cluster bombs. With the recoil of the electromagnetic cannon, it instantly pulled away from Cthulhu, tore through the void, and left this place. Meg heaved a sigh of relief as he watched the mushroom cloud rise from the ice field. He felt as if he had just survived a disaster. "This is too scary." Noah slumped to the ground. His entire body was drenched in sweat, as if he had collapsed. The rare thing was that he was still holding the Buddha jumps over the wall in his arms. The jar actually did not shatter. Melander was also panting heavily. Although he had seen countless deaths in his life, he did not want to die in the hands of Cthulhu. Even if it was his corpse, he did not want to fall into its hands. At this moment, he finally felt how ridiculous he was. He had actually been trying to find Cthulhu and kill it for hundreds of years. Irina came to Meg's side and reached out to hold his hand. She asked with concern, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. It's just a small injury." Meg shook his head and looked at the wound on his arm that was cut by Rankster's spear. "What is this?" Irina asked as she cast a healing spell on Meg. This was a spacious and empty room. The 4 walls were made of steel, and there was only transparent glass that faced the outside world. She saved us, Meg said. Irina was deep in thought and did not ask any more questions. Right at this moment, the door at the side opened, and a woman in white tights walked out of the operation cabin. Noah and Melanie turned around and looked at her in surprise. Then they fell unconscious. I will erase their memories, she said to Meg before her gaze landed on Irina. This is my wife, someone who should know about this and be able to keep it a secret, Meg introduced. Thank you for saving me. Irina looked at she and thanked her. If she had not appeared earlier, Cthulhu's tentacles would have pierced her heart. She nodded slightly and withdrew her hand. Cthulhu controls many ancient corpses. I'm afraid this ice field will become the source of its soldiers. These fearless and numerous ancient corpses will bring a terrible calamity to the Norland continent. Meg looked at she with a grave expression. Perhaps the ancient ones have a way to kill it. Cthulhu is immortal. We can only try to reseal it. Even the ancient ones can't kill it. She shook his head. Meg's heart was heavy. She and the Ancient One's most advanced battleship still could not kill Cthulhu. This was not good news. It would not be easy to reseal it. The Ancient Ones once swore that they would not enter the Norland continent on a large scale. You can only rely on yourselves to resist Cthulhu and the zombie horde it controls. She shook his head. No ways. Meg raised his brow. The strength of an ancient corpse could not be underestimated. It probably retained about 60% of its strength, and it was fearless under Cthulhu's control. It was an absolutely loyal death warrior. It was still unclear how many ancient corpses Cthulhu controlled. If it was a 1,000,000-strong army, even the entire Roth Empire would not be able to stop them from going south. Stopping the ancient corpse army is the key, but killing or resealing Cthulhu is the root of the problem, Irina pondered. Moreover, we did not see Josh today, but today's arrangement seems to be his doing. She nodded. When Cthulhu was sealed back then, it was cut into two. Its head was sealed in the center of the seal, and its lower half was sealed under the Sky Island. Its head is better at spiritual control. These ancient corpses are not controlled by the lower half of its body. It is more likely that the recorded head is controlling that puppet and then indirectly controlling it. If we miss it today, it will not be easy to find it in this vast ice field in the future. Meg frowned. I left a location tracker on it. It can determine its location. She raised her hand to raise a virtual screen. A red dot was moving quickly. But the problem now is not where it is, but how to reseal it and find the brain that really controls the ancient corpses. Meg looked at She's virtual screen and nodded. As long as we can determine its location, the sealing spell formation can be solved, and we can also think of a way to reseal it. However, the most important thing now is to unite all the races of the Norland continent and quickly build an alliance to resist the zombies and stop the ancient corpses from going south. The advanced civilizations were ultimately unreliable. They could only rely on themselves to save the Norland continent. The 5-star warship stopped 250 kilometers away from Rodu. She used hypnosis to erase part of Noah and Melander's memories, and then let Meg and the rest leave. Don't come over. Noah suddenly sat up from the griffin's back. His forehead was covered in cold sweat. He looked around and met the gaze of Meg, who was squatting in front of him. He then turned around abruptly and saw Melander, who was slowly waking up beside him. Only then did he heave a sigh of relief. What's going on? Melanie sat up and patted his dizzy head. Previously, they encountered Cthulhu on the ice field and were in a desperate situation. When they were about to be swallowed, he was suddenly attacked and fainted. After that, he could not remember anything. We were lucky to escape. Meg threw 2 water bottles to them. But we were not very lucky. Cthulhu controlled the ancient corpses on the ice field, and his strength increased tremendously. He might invade the south at any time. We have to build an alliance to stop him before he makes his move. Noah tilted his head back and drank half a bottle of water. He looked at his hand, and then looked around.
He was a little lost.
Did my Buddha jumps over the wall drop? Chapter 2094. Noah was very sad. He had carried the Buddha jumps over the wall, through the ice cave, fought the ancient corpses, and had a close relationship with him. Yet, he had sacrificed himself in the battle. However, the good news was that Mr. Mac had promised to compensate him with Buddha jumps over the wall when they returned. There was probably nothing more blissful than being able to leave this cold snowfield and return to the big city full of pretty ladies. He could even eat a hot meal of delicious food. Meg brought Noah and Melander back to Rodu and settled them in the same house as before. Naturally, he didn't have time to make Buddha jumps over the wall for them. He could only reward them with 2 packets of instant noodles. Instant noodles? This name sounds a little evil. Noah squatted by the table and observed the food in the mysterious package carefully. Do you know how to cook? Melander asked as he took a puff from a pipe for himself and glanced at him. Mr. Mac said that you don't need to know how to cook to eat instant noodles. You just need to boil the water and pour everything in the package into the bowl. Then, add boiling water and wait for a while. Noah agreed and started to cook. 5 minutes later, the father and son each held a bowl, raised their heads, and drank up the noodle soup. They even licked the bowl unsatisfactorily. I didn't know that my culinary skills were so amazing. It was indeed a waste of talent in the past. Noah put down the bowl with a look of amazement. If you had such skills in the past, we wouldn't have to starve in the wild. Melander reached out and gave them chestnuts. Noah nodded with an aggrieved expression. Grandpa, this is also a newly discovered talent of mine. There will be plenty of opportunities to show it later. Melander picked up the pipe again and smoked. But, Grandpa, what should we do next? We can't beat that Cthulhu, Noah asked as he cleared the bowls and chopsticks. In the past, he was full of confidence and wanted to find the devil with his grandpa. Now that he knew how scary the devil was, he had lost all his fighting spirit. They weren't on the same level at all. Even if that devil stayed there and didn't retaliate, he wouldn't be able to kill it. Mr. Mac went to find an alliance between the various races. We ghosts can also do our part. Melander put down the pipe. When the nest is overturned, no egg can remain intact. If Cthulhu controls the Norland continent, it will be completely over. Meg made 10 copies of the photo stones and sent them to the various powers through Chaos City's channels. After that, he and Irina headed straight for the Rodu Royal Palace. The purple-striped griffin hovered outside the palace and let out a long cry. The auras of over 20 powerful beings were immediately released from the Imperial Palace, and countless powerful beings were converging toward this location from all over Rodu. Several layers of defensive formations rose up, heavily protecting the Imperial Palace and the several main halls. In the blink of an eye, the Imperial Palace had entered a state of battle readiness. Above the Imperial City, several auras locked onto Meg and Irina. Alex and Irina's sudden appearance outside the Imperial Palace in the middle of the night came as quite a shock to all of the powerful beings in Rodu. Alex, why have you come to visit so late at night? A vigorous voice sounded from the top of the city gate tower. Meg looked at the armored general on the city gate tower and loudly said, Marshal Dominic, I have something important to discuss with King Andre. It has to do with the safety of the Norland continent. Please pass on my message to him.
All right.
Wait here. I'll get someone to report to His Majesty, Dominic replied, and instructed his subordinates to do so. Over 109th tier and 10th tier powerhouses arrived one after another and took up positions outside the palace. They were also staring at the purple-striped griffin and the 2 legendary figures on the griffin with restraint and vigilance. Both parties faced off in silence just like that. The Rodu Royal Palace was the safest place on the Norland continent. No matter how powerful Alex was, he couldn't force his way into the palace. Even though there were over 20 10th tier powerhouses in the Rodu Empire present, they weren't confident that they could capture Alex and Irina outside the palace. His Majesty has decreed that Alex and Irina are to enter the palace. Not long after, a drawn-out voice sounded from the palace. Open the city gate, Dominic ordered. The palace gate opened slowly, and the guards standing in front of the gate also parted to the sides. The purple-striped griffin landed. Meg and Irina jumped off the griffin and walked into the palace. Dominic led a few 10th-tier powerhouses down from the city tower and welcomed Meg and Irina. "Follow me," Dominic said, and led the two of them into the depths of the palace. 6 10th-tier powerhouses followed behind them and kept their guard up against the two of them. Meg didn't say a word, either. Only Andre could make this decision. In order to avoid unnecessary panic, it was better for as few people as possible to know about this. The group of people walked through the long corridor of the palace and finally stopped outside a huge hall. "General Dominic, Alex, and Irina, please enter the hall," the official at the door said loudly. Dominic led the way into the hall. Meg and Irina exchanged a look and followed him into the hall. This was a meeting hall, where Andre and his subordinates discussed matters. Alex used to be a frequent visitor here. Meg and the rest visited in the middle of the night, and the hall was brightly lit, but only Andre was sitting on the main seat. However, the moment Meg entered the hall, he was locked on by a few powerhouses. Meg glanced at the shadow behind Andre and frowned, but quickly regained his composure. Dominic sat down on Andre's left. "Alex, Irina, please take a seat." Andre smiled and raised his hand. Meg and Andre sat down in the last row. "Why are the two of you here in the middle of the night?" Andre asked Meg. "This is what we experienced in the Roth Empire's extreme north snow plains today. Your Majesty can take a look first." Meg took out an image recording stone. Andre raised his hand, and a servant at the side quickly took the image recording stone from Meg and quickly played it on the equipment in the meeting hall. This was the video that Meg let the system record during the battle. It included the disappearing ancient corpses in the underground cavern, the battle between him and Rankster, and the scene of Cthulhu crawling out from under the ice and commanding countless ancient corpses to attack them. Andre's and Dominic's expressions changed drastically when they saw this. Dominic even stood up from his chair. What is this?" Andre's voice was trembling. Although it was just an image recording, the gelatinous thing covered in scales still gave him a huge impact. He even felt fear from the depths of his soul. "This is Cthulhu, a devil from hell. It broke free from the seal under the Golden Dragon Island and is an unkillable monster," Meg introduced calmly. "It controlled those ancient corpses? And made them fight for it?" Dominic asked Meg.
Yes.
"It used some method to control these ancient corpses and let them retain 50 to 60% of their abilities when they were alive. Also, they can be fearless and carry out orders resolutely." Meg nodded. Dominic's expression was grave. As the Empire's marshal, he knew very well what such an undead army meant. Even the Empire's most elite Northwestern cavalry couldn't guarantee that every soldier could be fearless and carry out orders resolutely. "They're going south." Andre had already regained his composure and asked Meg. "I don't think it resurrected them just to hold an undead party on the ice plains," Meg said with a smile. "Andre, it seems like your previous judgment was right. The seal under the Golden Dragon Island has something to do with Rankster. He has already sold his soul to the devil," Dominic said in a low voice with a tinge of regret. Heroes appreciated each other. As one of the few people with the most unyielding fighting style in this world, Dominic had a good impression of Rankster. However, from the previous images, Rankster had indeed lost himself and become the devil's puppet. Rankster still has a trace of consciousness. "He hasn't been completely controlled," Meg retorted, but he didn't mention Elizabeth. "If the devil wants to bring the undead army south, what are your plans?" Andre asked Meg with a deep gaze. "If the devil and the undead army come south, the Roth Empire will be the first to bear the brunt of it. There's no way to avoid it." Meg looked at Andre. "I'm here to inform you to be prepared for battle, lest you get caught off guard." Andre stared at Meg for a while, but he didn't say anything else. "You want the Roth Empire to resist the devil and the undead army alone?" Andre asked with a frown. "If we can't, the Roth Empire will definitely be the first to be destroyed." Meg nodded. Dominic was silent. From the far North Highlands all the way south, it became flatter after entering the Roth Empire. If the devil and his undead army wanted to go south, the only choice was to start from the Roth Empire. The Roth Empire had no choice at all. Andre's face darkened, and he said, "What about after the Roth Empire is destroyed? Will the other races be spared?" Meg looked at him calmly and said, "Actually, this is not something I should consider. Even if I'm willing to form an alliance with the other races to deal with the devil and the undead army, the final decision will still be made by you people in power. You should know better than anyone that this concerns the fate of the entire Norland continent," Andre said as he looked into Meg's eyes. Meg asked, "If there's no peace agreement, do you think the other races will send troops to help the Roth Empire stop the devil and the undead army?" "Are you threatening me?" "No. I'm just telling you that there's no use threatening me at this time." Meg pointed at the image of Cthulhu on the screen. "If you think the Roth Empire can deal with this fellow, this world is yours." Andre stared at Meg in silence. He kept quiet. Meg looked at him calmly and didn't say anything else. Dominic broke the silence and stood up to tell Andre, "Your Majesty, we need the help of the other races." As the Marshal of the Empire and the commander of the three armies, he had to clearly inform His Majesty what kind of predicament and enemy the Empire was facing. Chapter 2095. When Meg and Irina left the palace, they received a promise from Andre. The Roth Empire was willing to join the peace alliance and sign a new peace agreement. As a condition, the various races in the peace alliance had to send out a huge allied army to stop the devils and the undead army from going south together with the Roth Empire. "Where are we going now?" Irina asked Meg. "You go home first. I'm worried about leaving the two children at home. I have to make a trip back to Chaos City and talk to Michael personally," Meg said.
All right.
"Be careful on the way back." Irina nodded and used the teleportation portal to return to the tavern. The purple-striped griffin soared into the sky and flew out of the city towards the south. "What are the chances of the Roth Empire winning against the undead army with our military strength?" Andre asked Dominic in the hall. 50%, Dominic replied. "Then why not fight? Although we have a 50% chance of winning, even if we win in the end, Your Majesty won't have any more troops to use," Dominic said seriously. "The undead are different from living creatures. They have no fear. They only want to be killed. They don't have the concept of surrender or failure. The icy plains of the extreme north are ancient battlefields with countless corpses buried there. If that devil really controls them, we might have to face a terrifying army. Your Majesty, we can still fight the undead army, but we can't deal with that devil alone. That day at the sealed land in Chaos City, I saw with my own eyes how scary that thing is. It's definitely not something that 10th-tier powerhouses can kill and deal with together." Andre was silent for a long time before he finally sighed deeply. The image recording stones that were sent to the dragons were immediately delivered to Douglas and Lewis, who were still in Rodu. The two of them looked at each other after watching the photo stone in the secret chamber. They saw the shock in each other's eyes. "How trustworthy is it? You think Alex has a need to lie to us?" The two of them were silent for a while. "Rankster is indeed controlled by the devil, and his power has increased to a certain extent. He can fight Alex on equal footing," Douglas said with a complicated expression. Lewis's expression was also very solemn, and he said in a deep voice, "A devil that has broken free from the restrictions of the seal is the most troublesome. And now, it's controlling a huge number of ancient corpses. This is a calamity that can engulf the entire Norland continent. Even the giant dragons won't be able to escape unscathed." Douglas looked at the final image of the terrifying, indescribable object with a heavy heart. "Now, we can only wait for the results of Alex and Andre's negotiation. If he can convince Andre to join the peace alliance and sign the peace agreement, all races will be able to work together to get rid of the devils and the undead army," Lewis said with a slight nod. "What is this?" She, who had just finished writing her diary and made a report, found a small brown cup in the corner of the cabin. The small cup looked ordinary, and its craftsmanship was not high quality. It was even a little rough. It should have been left behind by Meg and the others. She picked it up and shook it gently. There was the sound of soup sloshing inside. After hesitating for a moment, she opened the lid of the small cup. A rich fragrance wafted out of the small cup and quickly filled the cabin. It smells so good. She's eyes lit up as she looked at the small cup in her hand in disbelief. It was a cup of soup. There were various ingredients floating in the brown soup. Although the soup was already cold, it still emitted an irresistible aroma. It was even more tempting than the cold mixed pig tongue and cold mixed pig ears that she had the other day. Is this food that they accidentally left behind? She gulped. Mark, unknown food number 1 as an observer, she had the responsibility to investigate all unknown things on the Norland continent, including food. According to human eating habits, food will be heated to kill germs and give the food a better texture and fragrance. She put the small cup into the heating device and set a heating time.
Ding!
The heating was complete. She opened the small table and took out the heated cup. She turned on the camera and aimed it at herself and the small cup on the small table. Then, she reached out and opened the lid of the small cup. Steam rose up, and the aroma bloomed. She's eyes widened as she looked at the small cup in front of her in disbelief. This aroma was too special and impactful. I can smell its fragrance. There should be some kind of fungus, seafood, and meat in it. It's hard to describe this kind of fragrance with a general concept. They have distinct layers, but they are perfectly and harmoniously blended together. It's a very wonderful and tempting fragrance. What's strange is that I smell wine in it. They actually used wine to cook food. She explained to the camera. She didn't expect herself to use so many adjectives and talk so much. This was a little inconsistent with her usual style. However, in order to recreate the authenticity of this food as accurately as possible, she could only describe it this way.
She zoomed in.
I can see that there are many ingredients in this cup of soup. Meat, shellfish, mushrooms, and many other ingredients that I don't recognize. But the amazing thing is that although the soup is brown, it's very clear and doesn't feel turbid or greasy at all. The state of the ingredients is just right. There are so many different ingredients, but they can be so precise. This chef must have very strong control. She zoomed out and then scooped up a spoonful of soup with a spoon. After waiting for a while, she put it into her mouth. The delicious soup slowly soaked into her taste buds. She felt like her taste buds were moistened by a fine spring rain and gradually woke up. The soothing feeling was wonderful. The savory taste of the various ingredients was fully displayed in this mouthful of meaty broth, blooming on her taste buds. Even with her supersensory ability, her brain could not accurately distinguish each taste in a short period of time. She closed her eyes and seemed to see mushrooms that had just emerged from the needles, shellfish that crawled slowly on the bottom of the sea, and pheasants that walked through the grass fresh. It was fresh, and delicious. The strong aroma of the wine seeped into the soup, making it even more intoxicating. She opened her eyes and looked at the camera in silence for a while before quietly drinking another mouthful of soup. It's hard to describe the taste of this soup with words. It's so delicious and fresh. Among the food I've tasted, nothing can compare to it. She looked at the camera and said, "Next, let's try the ingredients in this soup." She scooped up a piece of shark's fin with a spoon. Just as she put it to her mouth, it slid into her mouth with a slurp. The shark's fin that was soaked in soup had a very wonderful texture and a wonderful taste. It rippled in her mouth before she swallowed it. Next was the chicken. The chicken looked small and stiff. When she bit into it, it did not have the expected texture of rotten meat. Instead, it had the perfect amount of tenderness and softness. Moreover, it did not only have the taste of chicken. The aroma of wine, seafood, mushrooms, and various meats had been blended together perfectly. There was flavor within flavor. When chewed, it was soft but not rotten. The aftertaste was endless. Sorry, I seem to have forgotten to explain the process. She looked at the empty small cup in front of her and was silent for a long time. This recording ends here. Unknown food number 1 incomplete. She turned off the camera and stared at the small cup for a long time.
What kind of food is this?
She couldn't control her curiosity. As a professionally trained observer, this was an emotion that should not appear. Chapter 2096. Michael was Meg's favorite leader. Their similar ideals and judgments always allowed them to reach a consensus very quickly. This is an event that will definitely be recorded in history. You have started a new era of peace, Michael lamented as he looked at the letter of commitment in his hands. This is only a letter of commitment. It can only be considered as the first glimpse of dawn. Meg shook his head with a smile. Next, I don't have to go to all the races one by one, right? The content in this photo stone is enough for all the races to deeply consider the current situation. The Roth Empire joining the Peace Alliance also means that the War Alliance has lost its backbone and is no longer a cause for concern. Michael shook his head and put down the letter of commitment in his hands. He looked at Meg and said, Alex, the residents of the Norland continent should thank you. If the demons still have hope of winning the war, tell them that the first step before the Allied army goes up north to snipe the undead army is to get rid of all the unstable factors at the rear, Meg said with a smile. Michael also smiled when he heard that. In order to deal with those ancient corpses, I have recently researched a large-scale killing weapon. However, I need Chaos City's support to mass-produce it. Meg took out a stack of blueprints. This is
a bomb.
Meg then went to the textile factory to meet Ashley. As Irina's trusted general, Ashley was one of the few people who knew his identity. The situation in the north is a little urgent. I hope the textile factory can suspend all the businesses on hand and rush out this batch of cannons. Meg handed a stack of blueprints to Ashley. Ashley took the blueprints and asked Meg, Is this Her Highness' order? Meg nodded with a smile. Her order should be delivered tomorrow. Ashley nodded slightly before flipping through the blueprints. After a while, she looked at Meg and said, Elves are not good at forging. If the situation is urgent, it might be more efficient to hand it over to the dwarven blacksmiths. This thing is a little special. I don't want others to have it for the time being. I only trust the night elves. Meg shook his head and seriously said, I need you to use all your production capacity to produce cannons. This might be able to reduce our casualties on the battlefield.
All right.
Ashley nodded solemnly. Meg only left Chaos City after he confirmed some problems with the craftsmanship with Ashley and told her to look for him if she had any questions. Host, your actions have already affected the normal development of the Norland continent. It might trigger a series of upheavals and attract the attention and punishment of the Heavenly Tao. The system's voice sounded. System, this is a world with an advanced civilization. They already operate interstellar battleships and use electromagnetic cannons. It shouldn't be too much for me to make a cannon, right? Furthermore, I only created the cannons to maintain the stability of this world. Isn't it too much to say that I've caused unrest? Meg curled his lips. She's performance on the ice field today had brought him great shock and inspiration. An interstellar battleship at full power could easily wipe out tens of thousands of ancient corpses. If the Roth Empire's knights were sent to the front line, they would be risking their lives. The electromagnetic cannon was too ridiculous, and Meg did not have the ability to build one. However, cannons were different. Meg had made some simple improvements to the red coat cannons of the Ming dynasty. Not only did they have powerful destructive power, but they would also not appear to be too radical and attract the attention of the ancients. The zombie army did not have any psychological weaknesses. Under Cthulhu's control, they could charge forward fearlessly. However, after being buried in the ice for countless years, the corpses were not as hard as imagined. Even if it was the allied forces of various races, the number of magic casters was limited. Every cannon could be seen as a magic caster who could release fireballs. If they could build a considerable number of cannons before the war, they would definitely play an important role in the war. Meg's idea was very simple. He wanted to kill more undead armies and let fewer allied forces die. Of course, he also wanted to avoid attracting the attention of the ancients because of the rapid development of technology. He did not want to be dissected for research now. He actually ran away. Interesting, in an ice cave, Josh was sitting on an ice throne as he looked down at Rankster with a smile. Rankster was silent. Since they ran away, it means that it's time for us to go south. We have been quiet for too long, and many people might have forgotten about our existence, Josh said with a cold smile as he rubbed the handle gently. Rankster nodded and turned to leave the ice cave. Alex, his resentment is really not small. Don't worry, I will help you catch him and make him suffer a fate worse than death. A low voice echoed in the ice cave. The photo stones that were sent to the various races caused a huge commotion. The demons outside Chaos City that had yet to break the seal had already shown the various races how terrifying the great old ones were. This demon that had broken free from the seal and gathered a terrifying number of ancient corpses was even more terrifying. The various races had already sent their representatives to Chaos City. This was an event that could affect the fate of all the races on the Norland continent. Even the demons who were isolated on the island did not think they would be spared. Before returning to Rodu, Meg made a trip to the staff dormitory. Elizabeth had not returned. Meg sighed. He wondered how she would feel if she knew about Rankster's current situation. Taking advantage of the night, the purple-striped griffin rose into the sky again and flew towards the north. Meg only returned to the tavern in Rodu when it was close to daybreak and made breakfast while he was at it. I went to the textile factory yesterday and got the night elves to help me make a batch of weapons. Ashley needs your authorization, Meg said as he scooped porridge for Irina. I will send her a letter later. Irina nodded and took the porridge from Meg. What did Michael say? His philosophy has always been close to ours. We will leave the Peace Alliance and the New Resistance Alliance to him. He is more professional than us. The two children were still asleep. Meg scooped a bowl of porridge for himself and sat down opposite Irina. If the demons and Oster still want to cause trouble, we will deal with them first and sign the peace treaty before heading north. That's pretty good. We have solved all the problems in one go. Irina nodded slightly. We are still not sure what position the Ancient Ones have. If they can participate in the war, no matter how many ancient corpses there are, they will only be cannon fodder. Even if there is only one battleship, its lethality will be greater than many 10th-tier powerhouses. Meg frowned. What we should be worried about now is Cthulhu and Josh. As long as we get rid of them, the undead army will collapse on its own. Irina shook her head slightly. Meg nodded. I will take a nap later. After that, we will set off to the north to find a suitable place to set up the sealing spell formation. Chapter 2097. Young Mistress, isn't this price a little too high? If our past customers see this, won't they turn around and leave? Mara looked at the new wine prices on the wall and was a little stunned. The 30-year-old Titan wine was priced at 3,000 copper coins per bottle and 999 copper coins per cup. Currently, this was the only wine on the wine list. There were also a few dishes that went with the wine, but their prices hadn't changed. However, the young mistress had changed suppliers in the past 2 days, and she had higher standards in terms of taste. We only have one wine at the moment, and we're selling less and less of it. This price is a little expensive, but it's not a big issue. Effie shook her head and heaved a faint sigh as she said, As for our past customers, I'll have to wait until I can bring out my own Titan wine to serve customers again. If we sell out all 50 bottles in a day, then we'll be able to earn 150,000 copper coins per day. Mara's eyes lit up. You're only thinking about money, money, money. Hurry up and tidy up the tavern. We're officially opening for business tonight. Effie slapped Mara's head with a displeased expression. All right. Mara was full of energy as she picked up the broom in the corner. A gratified smile also appeared on Effie's face as she looked at the newly renovated tavern. From today onward, the Titan Tavern had truly returned to its former glory. She directly opened up the neighboring shop and doubled the size of the Titan Tavern, transforming it from a medium-sized tavern that could only accommodate 20 or so tables to a large tavern that could accommodate 50 tables. Perhaps many people had forgotten that on Romo Street, apart from Mag, she also owned half a street's worth of shops. Back when the Titan Tavern was at its peak, her father's favorite thing to do was to buy shops. Aside from Romo Street, she also owned many shops all over Rodu. If it weren't for her true passion, she would have been able to live a very fulfilling life by riding a horse-drawn carriage every day instead of spending all her time in the brewery. After taking a tour of the tavern, Effie returned to the brewery behind the tavern. The distillation equipment that had been modified by Meg used durable coal as fuel, and she didn't have to keep an eye on the distillation process at all times as long as she wasn't checking on the progress of the distillation process. It could be said that the entire distillation process had become very simple. The fermented grape essence was converted into steam during the distillation process, and it flowed through a long pipe into the wine reservoir on the other side of the distillation equipment, where it transformed into drops of almost transparent liquid. Compared to when she brewed wine in the past, the entire brewery was enshrouded in mist and the fragrance of the wine. Now, there was almost no steam leaking out of the winery, and all the essence had been properly preserved.
Ding!
A crisp sound of a notification. AI Faye, who was in a daze, collected his thoughts. He was stunned for a moment before he remembered to close the furnace's inlet and turn off the fire. The Titan Tavern, after the new equipment, of the new batch of Titan Tavern. Effie's expression. The pressure of the air pressure valve decreased until the air pressure was completely balanced. Only then did Effie take a cup and connect it to the bottom of the wine reservoir and turn the switch. Clear and transparent wine gushed out from the wine spout, along with a slightly stimulating wine aroma. It's done. Effie's face lit up with joy. This wine fragrance was exactly the same as the one she had smelled when her father brewed wine in the brewery. It was also the fragrance that she had been searching for and trying to create in the past 10 years, but to no avail. She didn't expect Mr. Hades to change her brewing equipment and streamline a few processes, allowing her to successfully brew pure Titan Tavern. It's done. Miss succeeded. Mara, who had just walked into the brewery, was also pleasantly surprised. It's only half done. Titan Tavern doesn't have a soul unless it's stored for at least 2 years. Effie shook her head with a smile and said, Mara, go get the oak barrels. I need to first mix these raw wines into qualified Titan Tavern and then put them into barrels to seal. Okay, Mara immediately replied. When Effie put the first batch of Titan Tavern into the oak barrels and closed the lid, it was already 3 in the afternoon. Miss, this is too heavy. We can't move it with just the 2 of us. Mara patted the oak barrels that were about the same height as her. This was a huge barrel that could hold 300 bottles. Let's leave it here first. We'll get someone to help move it to the cellar tomorrow. Effie wiped the sweat off her forehead with a silk handkerchief and looked at her sweat-soaked clothes with disdain as she said, I'm going to take a shower and change my clothes first, then rest for a while. We still have to open for business at night. I'll go boil some water for you, Mara replied. The Titan Tavern and Saipan Tavern stood everyone up on their first day of winning the Double Gold Award. This had already become a topic of ridicule among the customers of Rodu for the entire day. However, it was precisely because they didn't get to drink water that they were shrouded in a veil of mystery, which made them even more curious. News about the Saipan Tavern had also started to spread. Among them was the news that Duke Abraham and Princess Vanessa were regulars of this tavern, and that the owner of the tavern was rather mysterious, which also spread like wildfire. While everyone was curious about the Maotai wine, they also reminded themselves to be careful in the Saipan Tavern. The sky wasn't dark yet, but there were already customers loitering in front of the 2 taverns. However, the doors of the 2 taverns were still tightly shut as if they had already discussed it beforehand. It didn't look like they were going to open for business, which made the customers who came early feel a little disgruntled. Effie looked at the 8 waiters of the Titan Tavern with a serious expression and said, Today is the first day of the Titan Tavern's reopening, and also the first day of our upgrade to a high-end tavern. Be on your guard, and don't make any mistakes. Yes. Everyone agreed one after another. At the same time, in the Saipan Tavern on the other side, Meg looked at the increasing number of customers outside and frowned slightly as he complained, Looks like it's time for our tavern to hire employees. Otherwise, we won't be able to serve enough customers. When we leave in the future, we'll have to find someone to run the tavern. Do you need me to arrange a few night elves for you? Irina asked. No, this is Rodu. They have to be humans. Meg shook his head. Not every elf could disguise themselves like them. It would obviously be easier to find employees in Rodu. Irina put down her bowl, wiped her lips elegantly, and said with a smile, I'm going to make a trip to the Wind Forest tonight. I'll leave this place to you. Mag looked at the crowded customers outside and could already imagine the chaos that would ensue on this night. Chapter 2098. So, which tavern are we going to choose tonight? Kurt asked with a smile as he stood in the middle of the road and looked at the Titan Tavern on his left and the Saipan Tavern on his right. Only children make choices. I'll take both. Fergus shook his head with a smile. Then, which tavern shall we start with? Of course, it's the Saipan Tavern. I only drank a little that day, and haven't tasted it yet. I've been thinking about it for the past 2 days. Fergus walked toward the Saipan Tavern without hesitation. That is indeed the case. Kurt followed with a smile. The Saipan Tavern today was more lively than usual. This was a little unfriendly to the regulars who were already used to drinking at the Saipan Tavern. However, after hearing that the Mautai wine had won the gold medal at the wine tasting conference, everyone still felt a little proud when they saw the shiny trophy on the wine cabinet. The style of this tavern is a little retro. Kurt walked into the tavern and scanned the surroundings. There were no dazzling decorations or lights. The tavern was mainly made of simple wood and dark colors, making it feel warm and comfortable. They weren't late, but there were only 2 empty tables left. Go and take a seat over there. I'll go and order some wine so that there won't be any seats later, Kurt said to Fergus. Sure. Fergus nodded with a smile. Speaking of which, it had been many years since he went to reserve a seat because he was worried that there wouldn't be enough seats. Kurt came to the bar counter and looked up at the wine list on the wall. Mautai wine, 2,000 copper coins per bottle. It was surprisingly cheap. There was no lack of expensive wine in Rodu, but none of them could be compared to Mautai wine in terms of quality. The price of 2,000 copper coins per bottle was definitely a kind boss. Whiskey, 2,000 copper coins per bottle. What wine is this? Kurt was instantly interested. Since it could be sold at the same price as Mautai wine, could it be that the quality was similar? Kurt looked around, but couldn't find a waiter who could order. What would you like to order? A soft and cute voice sounded. Kurt took 2 steps forward before noticing the little girl sitting behind the counter. The little girl was small, but she was really cute. Kurt revealed a kind smile and said, I'd like a bottle of Mautai wine and a bottle of whiskey, and all the dishes to go with the wine. All right. Amy nodded and quickly said, it's a total of 4,120 copper coins. Because the shop is too busy, we paid the bill in advance. Kurt, who was about to return to his seat, stopped in his tracks when he heard that. Looking at the huge tavern, only the boss was busy in the kitchen, and a young lady was serving dishes. He was indeed very busy. What if we don't have enough to drink later? Kurt joked as he dug into his purse. What you should be thinking about is how you're going to get drunk later, Amy said with a smile. Kurt was taken aback for a moment before he smiled confidently. He had been in the wine industry for decades and had drunk all kinds of strong and fine wines, but he had never been knocked out by a single bottle. All right, I want to see if this wine is really that strong. Kurt paid the bill and returned to his seat with a smile. Why are you so happy? Fergus asked with a smile. This boss's daughter is really interesting. I ordered 2 bottles of wine, and she was worried that we would get drunk. Kurt laughed. Only 2 bottles? Little girl, you haven't seen us when we were young, drinking 10 bottles each. Fergus laughed as well. I saw that this tavern not only has Mautai, but also a type of wine called whiskey. It's the same as Mautai. Both are 2,000 copper coins a bottle, so I ordered a bottle of each. I'll try it later before ordering. Whiskey? Fergus said with a bit of surprise. To be able to sell it at the same price as Mautai, It means that this wine is on the same level as Moutai in the boss's heart. Interesting. Then I want to see if this young boss can really make two good wines on the same level as Moutai, Kurt said with a smile. The two waited for a while before Meg walked over with 2 bottles of wine and 3 dishes. Meg wasn't surprised to see Kurt and Fergus, because he had already seen many of the faces he had seen at the wine tasting conference. I didn't expect the 2 of you to come too. Meg put down the dishes and said with a smile. I only drank a few mouthfuls that day and wasn't satisfied. Of course I'll come again. Kurt looked at the 2 bottles of wine on the table and asked with some curiosity, Mr. Hades has 2 wines. Why is he only sending Moutai to the wine tasting conference? I heard that the wine tasting conference only has 1 gold medal. Meg nodded slightly and then turned to walk towards the kitchen. Kurt and Fergus paused slightly and only came back to their senses when Meg turned around. I haven't seen this kind of confidence in a young man for many years. Kurt looked at Meg's back. I want to see what kind of whiskey he's worried about not having enough gold medals to get. Fergus took the bottle of whiskey, pulled out the stopper, and poured it into 2 glasses. The aroma of the wine wafted out, carrying with it a faint burnt smell and a strong smoky smell. The 2 picked up their glasses and furrowed their brows at the same time. Is this a failure? Fergus looked at the brownish-yellow wine with hints of red in the glasses. He had only smelled the smoky smell in some very failed wines, and that was a serious mistake in the drying process. This made his impression of Meg drop a little. A qualified winemaker wouldn't let a failure appear in front of the guests, unless he wanted to rely on the success of Moutai to play a little trick in front of the guests. Kurt's original thoughts were similar to Fergus, but just as he was about to put down the glass, he suddenly felt something was wrong. He moved the glass closer and used his left hand to fan the mouth of the glass lightly to concentrate the aroma of the wine. It's not a failure. This is its unique aroma. Kurt's eyes lit up as he looked at Fergus with some surprise. Aroma?
Yes.
Smell it carefully again. This smoky smell isn't disgusting. On the contrary, after the initial discomfort, you'll find it even more fascinating. And after you get used to the smoky smell, you'll discover other aromas hidden within. Yes, it's the aroma of malt. Kurt was as surprised as a child who had discovered a huge secret. Fergus doubtfully picked up the wine glass again and imitated Kurt's actions to sniff the aroma of the wine. After a while, his eyes widened and his expression became a little incredulous. Let's not talk about it anymore. Let's try it first. Kurt picked up the glass and slowly took a sip, using the tip of his tongue to swirl it around in his mouth. When the aroma of the whiskey filled his entire mouth, he carefully savored the different aroma in different parts of his mouth before swallowing. The taste was dry, mellow, round, and soft. The faint smoky taste brought about an intoxicating texture. Good wine. Kurt put down the glass and nodded solemnly at Fergus. End of chapter. Chapter 2099.
Shock.
That was the most profound feeling Kurt and Fergus had after tasting the whiskey. This wine smelled like a failed product at first, but under the charred and smoky aroma, there was a shocking and mesmerizing taste. He was like a wild man with a rough appearance, but he was shockingly knowledgeable. He spoke tirelessly, and people couldn't help but be intoxicated by his words. After a long while, the 2 of them put down their empty wine glasses at the same time. Fergus looked at Kurt and asked, if this is a wine presented at the wine tasting conference, how many points would you give it? 10 points without a doubt, Kurt said matter-of-factly. Fergus smiled and said, we should be glad that Mr. Hades brought Moutai. Otherwise, it wouldn't look good if we slapped our own faces on stage. Kurt couldn't help but praise, the younger generation will surpass us in time. There's really a genius winemaker in our Rodu. Not only is the wine brewed well, even the dishes are so delicious. Fergus swallowed the pig's ear salad in his mouth and grabbed a few peanuts to throw into his mouth. The 2 of them were completely convinced by Meg. He wasn't arrogant, but he had the ability to match it. The 2 of them ate delicious dishes and drank fine wine. Not long after, a bottle of whiskey and a bottle of Moutai were emptied into their stomachs. Kurt supported himself with one hand on the table and squinted as he asked, Do we want 2 more bottles? Come, cheers. Fergus answered vaguely from under the table. Meg went out and called the 2 coachmen and servants in, and directly carried them away. See, I told you they didn't need another bottle. Amy rested her chin on her hands and said with a smile as she watched the 2 of them being carried away. In this world, Moutai and whiskey with 40 to 50% alcohol content were definitely strong liquors. Those who boasted that they wouldn't get drunk after 1,000 cups were all drinking fruit wine with almost 0 alcohol content. As long as the urinary system could keep up, it wasn't strange at all to not get drunk after 1,000 cups. There were many new customers in the Saipan Tavern today, and they quickly got drunk as they hadn't experienced high alcohol tolerance. Luckily, those who could afford 2,000 copper coins a bottle of wine would bring their coachmen and servants with them when they went out, and this saved Meg a lot of trouble. The Saipan Tavern was harmonious. The situation at the Titan Tavern was not good. The reopened Titan Tavern had updated its wine list. The only wine they were selling now was the 30-year-old Titan wine, which cost 3,000 copper coins per bottle. The Titan wine, which was originally sold at a low price but in large quantities, had disappeared along with some of the low-priced wines that were sold on behalf of other breweries. This was tantamount to directly abandoning all the regular customers of the Titan Tavern in recent years and rejecting them at a price they could not afford. This caused many of the regulars who came to drink to be dissatisfied. They gathered at the door and demanded an explanation from AI Faye and the others. AI Faye walked out of the door and looked at the dozen or so regulars surrounding the tavern's entrance. He first bowed to them, then straightened up and said, "I'm sorry, everyone. Thank you for your constant support and love, but Titan Tavern is going to be upgraded. In order to uphold my father's will and make the Titan Tavern the best tavern in Rodu, I have to return it to its original position and work hard to make it continue to grow." The guests fell silent. "Lady Boss, are you going to stop selling wine to us in the future? 3,000 copper coins is too expensive. We can't afford it even if we don't drink for a month," a middle-aged man said with a wry smile. "Yeah, even if it's 1,000 copper coins per bottle, it's still too expensive," someone else chimed in. AI Faye looked at everyone and pursed his lips. He couldn't bear it. This is a Titan wine that just won the Gold Award. It was brewed by Master Marcus himself and stored for 30 years. The fact that the boss is willing to sell it at 3,000 copper coins per bottle is already a very generous price. If it were any of the 5 major taverns in Rodu, you wouldn't be able to drink a single bottle without at least 10,000 copper coins. A customer who had just walked out of the tavern stopped in his tracks and looked at the other customers drunkenly and said, "You should be content. After all, you used to drink Titan wine every day." After that person finished speaking, he sang a little tune and wobbled onto a horse-drawn carriage on the side of the road and left. Everyone looked at each other upon hearing that and immediately felt that it was boring, so they dispersed on the spot. AI Faye looked at all the regulars who had left and felt a sense of loss and disappointment in her heart. Don't think too much. Mississippi customers come and go like this. There's no such thing as a long-term relationship. It's just that the price is cheap, a customer consoled from the side. AI Faye came to her senses and turned to look at the man who had spoken. She felt that this middle-aged man was a little familiar, and she faltered for a moment before her eyes suddenly lit up, and she said, "You're Mr. Pasak. I didn't think that you would recognize me." The middle-aged man was also a little surprised. "You came to the tavern almost every day to drink, and you always sat near the door. Aside from drinking, your favorite dish was my mother's radish sticks." AI Faye nodded with a smile and said, "At that time, you often asked me to add radish sticks for you, and you would even give me some tips, so I remember you." "Yes, your mother's radish sticks and your father's wine are the most unforgettable memories for me." Pasak nodded with emotion. "I heard that at the wine tasting conference yesterday, you took out the Titan wine that your father had stored in the cellar for 30 years, and you were able to supply a certain amount every day, So, I came to take a look today. Yes, please come in. There are about 10 bottles left today. AI Face said with a smile. Then you must leave me a bottle. Pasak's eyes lit up and he followed her in. Seeing that the seat at the door was just empty, he sat down. After a while, AI Faye came in with a bottle of wine and a plate of radish sticks, and she placed the wine and dishes in front of Pasak. Although my wine is not as good as my father's, I learned how to make radish sticks from my mother. AI Faye smiled. Pasak picked up his chopsticks and picked up a piece of golden radish stick and took a bite. Kacha, the crisp texture, the slightly salty and sweet taste made Pasak's eyebrows raise, and he revealed a happy smile. I always thought that you were like your mother. Even the skill of making radish sticks has been passed down. It's very delicious, and it's the same taste as before. Pasak put down his chopsticks and gave AI Faye a thumbs up. Thank you, please enjoy. AI Faye turned and left with a smile on her face. Yes, guests always came and went like this, and only the taste could make a guest become sentimental. Even if more than 10 years had passed, just hearing the news, people would still want to come and take a look to find the taste in their memories. AI Faye suddenly knew what she was going to do. Let those guests who came in high spirits go back home. This was what she should do. Chapter 20, 100. The atmosphere of freedom gradually spread in the wind forest. Almost every elf felt the change. Slaves became a word that gradually disappeared, at least in the City of Life. Only a few conservative and stubborn lords who were far away from the City of Life still clung to their slave contracts, unwilling to give up their superior status. However, this situation started to change during this period. The elves in the territory already knew what was happening outside. Like all the other elves who had been enslaved for more than 100 years, they longed for freedom and were willing to pay a high price for it. The territory of the Brewster family was located in the southwest of the Wind Forest. After Sally became the new princess of the elves, Elliot's status rose, and the territory of the Brewster family more than doubled. The Brewster family had been in charge of the food supply for the elves for many years. Their territory was quite far from the City of Life, and there were many slaves and servants. These slaves did the most difficult work, supporting the food supply of the entire the Wind Forest. However, they never had enough to eat, and were often bullied, beaten, and scolded by the Brewster family. The sound of the slaves being freed had already resounded in the Wind Forest, but this territory surrounded by iron thorns still maintained its silence and absolute obedience by force. All the slaves were put in heavy iron shackles, but their work was not reduced. They were strictly forbidden from communicating with each other, and all news related to freedom was stopped. If a slave violated this rule, they would be tortured inhumanely and might even lose their lives. On the high railing of the farm, there was a corpse that had been pecked by vultures. We should take Joe's body back. He was so kind. If it weren't for saving his comrades, his legs wouldn't have been broken, and he wouldn't have been here collecting flower dew for 100 years. He wouldn't have been hanged by his own people in the end. In the dark and damp slave dormitory, an old elf turned over, and the shackles on his feet made a sound on the wooden planks. He looked at the lonely corpse hanging on the railing through the gaps in the wooden planks and said in a low voice. There were dozens of elven slaves in the dormitory, but everyone was silent. But the door is locked from the outside, and there must be someone guarding Joe's body. They want to hang more corpses on the railing to let us know what will happen if we resist. This is what I heard at noon. It's a trap. Someone said in the darkness. Someone sighed. The atmosphere became sorrowful and hopeless. So what? I just want my old friend to return to Mother Earth's embrace with dignity and not be humiliated by those disgusting birds. The old man who spoke earlier sat up on the bed. His eyes seemed to be shining even in the darkness. When he bravely pounced on the demons that invaded the Wind Forest, he never thought about whether he could come back alive. I'm going to retrieve his body, or let me hang up there with him. At least I'll feel better that way. The old man got up and stood on the narrow walkway. He looked at his clansmen who were shrouded in darkness, as if he was waiting for something. Silence. Silence again. The old man smiled and turned to walk towards the door. I think you need someone to kick the door open for you. A muscular elf jumped down from the bed on the second floor. The railing is too high. I'm afraid you won't be able to climb it.
Leave this to me.
A skinny, monkey-like elf jumped down nimbly. Even though he was wearing heavy shackles, he didn't make any sound when he landed. The old man looked at the two elves. The sorrowful smile on his face finally turned into relief. He nodded with a smile and said, Okay, you two step back. I'll kick the door open. After we get out, I'll run to the west and lure them away. You two go and retrieve Joe's body, the muscular elf said. Let me lure them away. I'm more agile, the skinny elf said. No, Albin. After you put Joe's body down, you can jump over the railing and leave. I know the iron wall can't stop you. The muscular elf grabbed the skinny elf's shoulder and said with a smile, Go and see the outside world for me. We've never left the farm since we were born. The outside world must be more exciting. Joe used to tell us about freedom, but we've never seen it. Maybe we'll see it after we leave the farm. Anton reached out his hand and rubbed Albin's head. Remember, don't come back. Anton, Albin choked. In the darkness, there were a few sobbing sounds. Anton took back his hand and took 3 deep breaths. Then he took a big step forward and slammed into the wooden door. The solid wooden door flew out along with the door frame. For freedom! Anton turned back and shouted at the row of slaves' dormitories. His voice pierced the darkness. Dozens of slaves' dormitories were shackled, but they were still silent. Go! Albin wiped his tears and ran out of the door like a cat. He jumped into the bushes and ran through the treetops like an agile monkey. He rushed to the railing where Joe's body was hanging. Anton glanced at Albin's direction and ran in the opposite direction. He picked up a long stick and smashed it all the way. The sound of the door breaking woke up the guards in the slave dormitory. A shrill whistle sounded. Torches lit up the yard one after another. The guards quickly controlled all the roads and found Anton running wildly. A low-level icicle spell penetrated his calf. The wooden stick in Anton's hand did not have time to swing at the guard in front of him. He fell to the ground. The guard stepped forward and raised the iron stick in his hand with a ferocious expression. He smashed it heavily on Anton's other leg. With a muffled sound, the leg was smashed and bent. For freedom! Anton raised his head and shouted. He was lying on the ground, but the wooden stick in his hand was still swung out and smashed heavily on the guard's leg.
Bang!
The wooden stick shattered and broke into several pieces. The elf guard's leg was also smashed by the stick. The elf guard clutched his leg and fell to the ground. He howled at the guards behind him, beat him to death. I want him dead. The guards responded and rushed forward with swords and sticks. They mercilessly attacked Anton. For freedom! For freedom! For freedom! Anton's voice gradually disappeared until only the muffled sound of weapons hitting flesh was left. Anton! Albin climbed to the highest railing and looked at this scene with eyes wide open. He tore the hemp rope that hung Charles' body. The dozens of slave dormitories that witnessed all this finally began to stir. They slapped the railing and wooden planks and let out angry and desperate roars. Shut up! The guards used their iron sticks to hit the elves who tried to reach out of the dormitory, trying to control the order. Someone is stealing the corpse. Catch him! At the same time, a guard found Albin standing on the railing and shouted angrily. 2 flying mounts had already taken off and were flying in Albin's direction. Albin, run! The old elf carried Charles' body on his back and shouted at Albin. Albin looked at the familiar farm. There was no warmth in his eyes. It was like a man-eating monster. There was only endless fear. He turned his head to look at the world beyond the railing. The vast sky, the endless green fields, the free air, and the purple-striped griffin swooping down from the sky. Chapter 20:101. The slogan that Anton shouted before he died was heroic and indignant. The elven slaves who had been imprisoned for 100 years saw Joe's body hanging on the railing for days. Their pent-up anger was finally unleashed at this moment. The strong slaves broke open the wooden door, and the angry slaves swarmed out. The ear-piercing alarm sounded in the sky above the Brewster family. "Go back to your cages, you stupid and despicable people." The guards didn't panic, and the magic casters had already started to build ice and earth walls. In the face of absolute power, numbers didn't bring them any advantage. A smooth and thick ice wall built a sturdy prison cell, allowing them to stand behind the ice wall and mock the slaves who were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. Their bodies and would left faint marks on the ice wall, and the slaves roared in anger and helplessness. They looked outside the ice wall and saw the guards humiliating Anton's body, but they couldn't do anything. This feeling of helplessness made them feel deep despair. It was as if they were born with fate, and they never had a choice. At this moment, a huge shadow fell from the sky. The thick ice walls suddenly shattered. The magic wand in the magic caster's hands also turned to ashes. Everyone looked up and saw the giant beast shining with purple light under the moonlight, and the beautiful elf with golden light sitting on the giant beast. "It's Princess Irina," a slave shouted. For the first time, panic appeared in the eyes of the guards. "What's going on?" Elliot came out in his pajamas with a frown. A middle-aged elf who looked like a butler came up and said respectfully, "Chief, there's a problem at the farm's slave cages. We've already sent the guards over, and they won't be able to cause any trouble." "Humph, these despicable people. I gave them food and clothes so that they could live, and they still dare to cause trouble." Elliot's face turned cold.
"Kill a few more this time.
Hang them together with the old guy who tried to escape a few days ago. I want to see how badly they want to leave." "Yes, Chief." The butler smiled and left. Elliot yawned and turned to enter the bedroom again. Ever since he was dismissed and returned to his territory, Elliot had felt the free atmosphere that was raging in the Wind Forest. He sealed off his fief and spread all the news among the slaves and servants. He didn't care about the flood outside. As long as he was in this castle, in this territory, he was still the supreme king, with the right to kill and seize. As it turned out, his method was very effective. While the other lords removed their slave contracts and were forced to release their slaves, he still had thousands of slaves under his control. They were the main force of the farm, supporting the Brewster family and the Wind Forest. Under the steward's lead, thousands of fully armed soldiers of the Brewster family surrounded the slave area. Slaves were not qualified to live in the castle. Like cattle and sheep, they were kept in a low bungalow outside the castle. Therefore, they were also called the slave pen. Outside the short single-story house, there was a fence of iron thorns that was several meters high. The fence was covered with sharp and highly poisonous iron thorns. The flames ignited the slave pen, and noisy sounds came from inside. Those were the sounds of battle and cheers. "Put out the fire. Then capture all the despicable bastards who dare to rebel," the steward ordered coldly. The troops agreed. A water elemental magician stepped forward and began to chant a magic spell. There were also fully armed close combat elves who opened the gates in 3 directions and swarmed in. Slaves were just 2-legged livestock with a long lifespan. As long as they had some beauty or magic talent, they would not be kept here. Coupled with the heavy shackles, they had no resistance in front of the powerful army. Many elven soldiers even thought that the guards must be asleep. Otherwise, just the dozens of guards in the slave pen would be enough to suppress the so-called rebellion. However, when they rushed into the slave pen and tried to solve all the problems with one charge and then go back to sleep, they were shocked by the scene in front of them. The battle was over. All the guards had been captured and tied up in the center of the empty space. Apart from the wounds on their faces, there was also endless fear. Meanwhile, those shackled elven slaves with angry and fanatical expressions were currently surrounding those guards. Of course, the elven slaves were not the ones who were shocked. Instead, it was the huge purple-striped griffin floating in midair and the beautiful elf sitting on its back. "It's Princess Irina's," An elf exclaimed. The elven soldiers who were charging forward subconsciously stopped in their tracks. They looked at Irina and could not muster up any courage to attack. They seemed to understand why the slaves who had always been obedient suddenly became excited and radical tonight. Your Highness Irina, I am Dirk from the Brewster family. What brings you here in the middle of the night? The steward said respectfully to Irina. The Brewster family was not a powerful family. Their patriarch, Elliot, was only a 9th-tier magician. They did not even have a 10th-tier powerhouse. Furthermore, this place was far away from the City of Life. Even if they asked for help now, High Priestess Helena might not be able to arrive in time. Anyone with a brain in the Wind Forest knew how powerful Irina was. At this moment, she appeared here and stood on the side of the rebelling slaves. He panicked. Take some elves and leave. Kill some fellows who don't deserve to be called elves, Irina said coldly. Dirk's expression froze. He knew very well that in Irina's eyes, he might be one of those fellows who did not deserve to be called elves. You're Albin, right? Find the murderer who killed Anton and Joe and avenge them. Irina looked at a skinny elf below. Albin nodded. He picked up a blood-stained dagger from the ground and walked toward the tied-up guards. Don't kill me. I didn't kill him. They killed him. The guard leader, who was thrown into the corner with his legs bent, screamed in horror. Albin walked up silently and stabbed the guard leader's thigh. Then he slashed downwards. The tendons and flesh were torn apart and blood spurted out. Ah! The guard leader let out a blood-curdling scream. The expressions of the guards and the soldiers standing not far away changed. Someone recognized Albin. He was the skinny monkey who was in charge of slaughtering livestock on the farm. This stab is for Joe. Of course, it's not enough. You stabbed him 12 times. I will pay you back double. In addition, Anton stabbed him 24 times. Also, you won't die before I finish stabbing him. I can guarantee that. Albin looked at the guard leader and said coldly. He raised his hand and made a cut on the guard leader's left leg, pulling out a tendon. Chapter 2102. The screams of the leader of the guards were accompanied by the sounds of sharp blades slicing through flesh, piercing through the dark night. The elven slaves all had elated looks on their faces. That was what they often thought when they were being oppressed for the past 100 years. There were no less than 10 slaves who had been tortured to death by this guy over the years. His methods were even crueler than this. The guards who were tied up had already begun to tremble in horror. They never would have thought that the slaves who could only be slaughtered by them would become existences who could kill them at will. Furthermore, they would really kill. Dirk and the elven soldiers under him were also shocked at this moment. They were in a dilemma. On the 48th stab, Albin stabbed the sword into the guard's heart, then let go of his hand and took a few steps back. He knelt down beside Anton's unrecognizable corpse and began to cry bitterly. Irina waved her hand and cut off all the shackles. Then, she looked at the over 3,000 elven slaves below and said, "An eye for an eye. Today, I hope you can leave this place without hatred and start a new life." The elven slaves fell silent for a while. Someone picked up a sword and walked toward those guards. Princess Irina, I don't think the High Priestess would want to see something like this. I hope you can reconsider. Princess Sally will be back in a few days. Dirk stepped forward nervously. Everything I've done is what Helena doesn't want to see, including my existence. Irina looked at Dirk and suddenly grinned. Then what do you think I should do? Make me disappear completely? Dirk choked. He wanted to, but he didn't dare to say it, and he couldn't do it. Before Dirk could say anything, Irina took out a black book and announced loudly, Dirk Brewster, Elliot's #1 butler, the absolute executioner of orders, and the executioner who is stained with the blood of many elves. Today, I sentence you to death, and you will be executed on the spot.
No.
Dirk turned around and tried to escape. A beam of light ignited his body, and he turned into ashes in the blink of an eye. The elven soldiers' mental defenses collapsed instantly, and they scattered like birds and beasts. As for those elven guards, almost all of them were killed by the slave elves. Only 5 of them were left, and they were protected by a few elves who were working hard.
They were forced to become guards.
Their hearts are kind, and they even helped us before, an old elf said loudly, convincing his companions to let the guards go. Princess Irina! Princess Irina! All of the fairies looked at Irina with fanatical expressions in their eyes. Just when they thought they were going to fall back into a life of despair, or even worse, she appeared. She broke through the ice wall, disarmed the guards' weapons and magic wands, and killed the evil and terrifying Dirk. She was like a ray of light in the endless darkness, bringing them hope. Now, I'll take you away from here and start a new life. Irina looked at the elves below and said loudly, "You're free." The wall of iron thorns fell and turned into ashes in the flames. "We're free! Freedom!" All of the fairies' eyes lit up as they looked around at the open field. There was no iron thorns in the sky, and everything seemed to have changed. "Let's go, I'll guide you," Irina said. A ray of light landed in front of them, and a path of light led into the distance. The fairies walked along the path of light. Albin bent over and picked up Anton's corpse and said softly, "Let's go, Anton. I'll take you to see the outside world." His small body bent over as he carried the corpse forward, and he stubbornly refused everyone's help. The castle not far away was brightly lit, and the city gates were closed. Irina looked in the direction of the castle and thought, "Elliot, your life belongs to Shirley, so you can keep it for a while." Has she left? After a long while, Elliot poked his head out of the bunker and asked, "Chief, they've already left. They're heading south," someone outside replied. "He really left?" Elliot was in disbelief. "Yes, the slave pen is empty. All the slaves have escaped," the person outside replied. He then asked, "Should we chase after them?" Elliot was so angry that he jumped out of the bunker and slapped him. He looked at the young elf and said, "Are you going to chase after them alone?" That elf took half a step back and shook his head with an aggrieved expression. "Damn, Irina." Elliot paced around the room and suddenly stopped. He clapped his hands and said, "Yes, we have to chase after them. You, bring 500 men and chase after them to the west," Elliot said as he pointed at the elf from before. That elf's expression changed, but he quickly said, "But they're heading south. If we want to chase after them, shouldn't we go south? What do you plan to do if we really chase after them?" Elliot looked at him. That elf was taken aback, and he looked a little scared. "Then why aren't you fucking chasing after them to the west?" Elliot lifted his leg and kicked him. "Yes, yes, yes." That elf scrambled away. Soon, a team of 500 cavalrymen set off and chased after them to the west. Send a request for reinforcements to the City of Life immediately, and then send a letter to the High Priestess via Eagle. Tell her that Irina killed hundreds of guards and soldiers of the Brewster family, kidnapped 3,000 slaves, and fled in the southwest direction. The Brewster family has already sent soldiers to chase after them and request for reinforcements, Elliot ordered. The eagle flew out of the castle and flew in the direction of the City of Life. Half an hour later, the castle received a reply from the City of Life. After reading the letter, Elliot almost ate the envelope. That damn old woman. Is she so scared of Irina? Damn it. Damn it. "Do you know why I didn't send my troops?" Helena asked Sally in the Starry Cave mansion. "Elliot is not a trustworthy person. He doesn't have the guts to fight with Irina, and he doesn't have any form of resistance," Sally said calmly. "Also, the freeing of slaves has already reached a consensus in the Wind Forest. This is an irresistible trend. Looks like you agree with Irina's actions." Helena looked at Sally. "I'm on the side of the trend. Now, most of the elves in the Wind Forest will agree with her actions." Sally remained calm. Helena smiled and lamented, "If Elliot had half of your wisdom and temperament, he wouldn't have ended up like this." Sally fell silent. After a long while, she looked up at Helena and asked, "Are you really going to make the wind forest undergo another revolution?" "I was going to, but I'm afraid it's too late now." Helena shook her head. She raised her hand, and a video began to play in the air. "This is..." Sally's expression changed drastically. Chapter 20:103. That's a total of 178,642 copper coins. "Miss, we're rich." Mara put the last copper coin into the money box and looked at Ify with surprise. She had followed Ify for more than 10 years. She had seen Ify run a tavern by herself and sell cheap drinks. After working hard for a day, she only earned 2,000 to 3,000 copper coins. But today, when they opened for business, they actually received so much money in one go. She had never seen so much cash in front of her in her entire life. Ify took out a dragon coin from the money box and gently blew on it. She put it next to her ear and listened to the pleasant sound of the money. She also smiled and said, "In the future, we will have this much every day. Our good days are coming." No one would think that having too much money was a problem, right? "So much money, where are we going to put it?" Mara asked. In the past, they only had a few thousand copper coins a day. They could easily carry it upstairs, and it was only enough to maintain the tavern's operation. Now that they suddenly had such a huge amount of money, it was unrealistic to carry it upstairs. They would have to carry it back and forth a few times. Moreover, it didn't seem safe to just leave it in the room. Ify thought for a moment and said, "Let's put it in the wine cellar for the time being. When we have 1,000,000 copper coins, we will exchange it for banknotes from Buffett Bank."
Okay.
Mara picked up the box full of dragon coins and gold coins and prepared to move the most valuable box to the wine cellar. Dong dong. At this time, a heavy knock on the door suddenly sounded. "Who is it?" Ify and Mara were stunned for a moment and looked in the direction of the door.
Bang.
The wooden door that was protected by a magic barrier was knocked open. A fierce-looking man with a huge axe in his hand jumped in and looked at Ify and Mara with a hideous smile. "Who are you? What do you want?" Mara shouted loudly.
Run.
Ify looked at the man, and her face turned white. She grabbed Mara and ran towards the back of the tavern. Mara lost her grip on the money box, and the dragon coins and gold coins fell to the ground with a tinkling sound. "Hee hee, little girl, where are you running? Give all the money to me, and let me have a good time. I won't kill you." The burly man grinned as he chased after Ify and the others with large strides, knocking aside all the tables and chairs along the way. Eiffel pulled Mara into the winery, pulled open the cellar door, and pushed Mara in. Then, she jumped down and pulled the heavy cellar door down with all her strength. The moment the door of the cellar fell, she saw a huge axe raised high and then smashed down.
Bang.
A muffled sound reverberated in the cellar. AI Faye's hand was numb from the shock. He quickly loosened his grip on the handle. Mara fell to the floor of the wine cellar. Her beautiful face turned pale, and her voice trembled as she said, Miss, what is he doing?" Seeing that the defensive magic circle had been activated, AI Faye's face relaxed a little. He came down from the escalator, squatted on the ground, hugged Mara, and patted her shoulder. "Don't be afraid. The cellar is safe. He can't come in."
Bang. 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 Bang.
A muffled sound of collision came from the cellar door. The defensive formation was shaking, and sand and dust fell down from the cracks. Eiffel hugged Mara. Her expression was serious, and her face was also pale. The memories that she had thrown to the back of her mind once again came rushing back.
It was still this wine cellar.
Back then, her father used all his strength to put her in the cellar, and then used his body to block the entrance of the cellar. That was the most terrifying scene she had seen in her life. Her father was hacked to death in front of the cellar by that thug with an axe. His blood seeped into the cellar and dripped into the dark cellar. Then, that thug crazily smashed the cellar door for more than 10 minutes before unwillingly leaving. At that time, she was young and could only cry in fear in the corner, hoping that someone would open the cellar door and save her. 15 years later, when Titan Winery was about to return to normal, the same thing happened again. The light of the defensive barrier was dimming, and the sound of the door being smashed was getting louder and louder. Eiffel hugged Mara tightly. The fear that made her body cold came again. What was different from 15 years ago was that she was no longer a child. There was a dim yellow light in the cellar, and Mara was trembling in her arms. Miss does he want to kill us? Mara's eyes were full of fear. She looked up at Eiffel and asked, It's okay. Eiffel hugged her a little tighter. She knew that the person outside was probably coming for them. The money was all outside, a full 170,000 copper coins. If he came for the money, he could just take it away. But he was wasting time and energy to attack the cellar. It was clear that his goal was not only the money, but also them. Thinking that she would fall into the hands of such a ferocious and terrifying man, Eiffel's heart turned cold. The two of them snuggled up to each other in the cellar, praying that someone would hear the sound and come to scare away the thug outside. But there were no residents around the winery. It was late at night, so no one would be able to hear the sound here. Eiffel thought of Mr. Hades, who lived across the street, but after thinking about it, she gave up on this idea. Although Mr. Hades was a man full of wisdom, he was not a strong man. Moreover, he had 2 children and a beautiful wife. She was definitely not willing to let him and his family suffer any harm because of her. She was very clear that this kind of thug would not care who appeared in the winery. Father, it seems like someone is causing trouble in the winery across the street. Amy, who was wearing bare pajamas, opened the curtains and looked at the Titan Winery across the street. Yes, it seems like a bad guy went in. Meg, do you want to go beat the bad guy together? Meg, who was wearing a bathrobe, used a towel to dry his hair and asked with a smile. He had just put on a lather when he noticed the movement across the street. But he was sure that Eiffel and the others had already entered the wine cellar, and the thug had not broken through the magic barrier of the wine cellar yet. So, he was not in a hurry to put on a show of being naked and saving the damsel in distress. Instead, he quickly took a shower and put on a bathrobe. Okay. Amy loves beating bad guys the most. Amy's eyes lit up, and she nodded her little head repeatedly. She looked around and picked up a small folding chair in the corner. She waved it around and nodded with satisfaction. She looked at Meg and said, Let's go. Meg looked at her folding chair and raised his eyebrows. This mother and daughter pair had very similar preferences. Okay, let's go. Meg stepped on a pair of slippers, opened the window, and jumped down from the second floor. Amy picked up the folding chair and also jumped down from the second floor. The father and daughter pair, who were wearing pajamas, walked into the shattered Titan Winery. Chapter 2104. A bare-chested, 2-meter-tall giant man with a valiant aura was crazily chopping at the cellar door with a huge black axe in his hand. Every time the axe chopped down, the light barrier on the cellar door would shake, and the light would weaken a bit. The giant man smiled. This meant that the barrier wouldn't last much longer. He would soon be able to chop open the cellar door with his axe, and then grab the 2 beauties hiding inside. Thinking of the beautiful female boss, her beautiful body, and her charming appearance, tonight they would all belong to him, and he would be able to ravage them, he was even more motivated. Damn magician. The giant man spat out a mouthful of saliva, took a short breath, and held the axe high above his head with both hands. His muscles tightened, and a black light condensed on the edge of the axe, and then he suddenly chopped down. Kacha, along with a crisp sound, a series of cracks appeared on the magic barrier, which quickly spread until it completely shattered. The axe fell on the cellar door without any resistance, and with a solid muffled sound. A crack also appeared on the cellar door. Success.
Ha ha ha.
The giant man grinned, and couldn't help but gasp for breath. But the magic barrier had already been chopped down, and the next step was simple. The woman in the cellar was much more valuable than the gold coins on the ground. Mara, Hide in the innermost wine cellar. No matter what happens, don't come out. Effie got up and pushed Mara into the passage.
No.
Miss, I won't go anywhere. I want to stay by your side. I won't leave you. Mara hugged her arm and cried while shaking her head. Her fearful face was full of determination. The magic barrier had already been chopped down, and Effie knew that the terrifying thug would soon come in. Her hands and feet were cold, and her heart was full of despair. Why was it like this 15 years ago? She had already lost her parents, and tonight she would lose her life in the same way. She had already grasped the dagger that she had always hidden. If that guy wanted to humiliate her, she would never let him succeed. Perhaps it would be a good place to end her life in this wine cellar that contained her father's life's work. Or maybe 15 years ago, she should have left with her parents, then at least Mara wouldn't be trapped here with her.
She was still a child.
Effie couldn't bear to look at Mara. The giant man once again raised the giant axe in his hand, panting heavily. With this swing of the axe, he would be able to completely destroy this terrible cellar door. This kind of physical work must be very tiring. A voice suddenly sounded from behind. Yes, I'm exhausted. The giant man nodded. His eyes widened as he suddenly turned his head to look behind him. Behind him, a young man and a little girl had appeared out of nowhere. One of them was leaning against the door frame while the other was sitting on a small chair, looking like they were watching a show. It seemed like they had been there for a long time. Who are you? The giant man was shocked. He turned around and shouted at Meg. We are neighbors. We live just across from each other. We came over to take a look since there were so many noises in the middle of the night. Did Miss Effie hire a construction team to replace the door and clean the cellar? Mag chuckled. Oh, it's your neighbor. The giant man slowly put down the axe in his hand. A simple and honest smile appeared on his ferocious face. He looked at Meg and determined that he was just a weak chicken of an ordinary man. He slowly walked toward him with the axe in his hand. Yes, we were about to go to sleep, but you woke us up. Amy pouted as she looked at the giant man. You really are a terrible guy. Miss, listen. It's Mr. Hades's voice. Mara suddenly pointed up and said with surprise. Effie, who was waiting for the last swing of the axe, also suddenly raised her head. Hope suddenly rose in her heart. But she quickly heard Amy's voice. Her face showed panic. She raised her head and shouted at the top of her voice. Run. Mr. Hades. He's a thug. Effie's voice came from the cellar. Meg looked at the giant man and asked with a smile. Is that so? She's right. There's a price to pay for meddling in other people's business. The silly smile on the giant man's face disappeared. His face was full of fat. He raised the giant axe in his hand and chopped down at Meg. He roared, Die for me.
Bang.
A muffled sound. The giant man with the axe was instantly sent flying. He was then embedded in the wall. His eyes were wide open and full of disbelief. Crawl for me. Amy held the folding chair with one hand and looked at the giant man and said in a childish voice, Look at you. How can you be so careless? Meg took 2 steps forward and smiled at the giant man who was struggling to dig himself out of the wall. I'm going to kill you. Although the giant man was shocked, he was also furious. He held the giant axe with both hands and rushed toward Amy again. On the axe, a black light flashed. He no longer held back.
Bang.
Another muffled sound of the folding chair hitting the giant man's face. The giant man was sent flying again. Lying on the ground, the 3 red lines on his face couldn't hide his shock and despair. Yes, he was sent flying by a little girl who looked like she was only 4 years old. And it was with a folding chair. He was sent flying twice in a row. This kind of thing happened like a nightmare. Meg looked at the dragon coins and gold coins scattered on the ground. He walked forward with a smile and stepped on the giant man's right hand that was trying to hold the axe again. The fingers that were like iron rods were directly flattened and stuck to the handle of the axe like meat paste. The giant man let out a blood-curdling scream. His face instantly turned deathly pale, and large beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. Tell me, who sent you? Meg looked down at the giant man and said with a smile, "If you don't want your other hand to become like this, you'd better not try to play any tricks." "No one sent me. I came here on my own. I know they made a lot of money today. I'm short of money." The giant man growled and stared at Meg with his bloodshot eyes. "I know you're short of money, but what you're short of is not the money on the ground." Meg went around to the other side and stepped on the giant man's other hand. He slowly increased his strength and continued to ask with a smile, "So, who promised you more money to deal with Mrs. Effie?" The giant man looked in horror at his left hand's fingers that began to deform under Meg's foot. The joints creaked and the piercing pain came again. He knew that Meg wasn't scaring him. He would really crush his fingers. Black market. It's a black market mission. The giant man screamed in horror.
Pop.
His left hand had also been stomped to pieces. "I'm sorry, I thought you'd be a little harder." Meg looked at the screaming giant man apologetically. He withdrew his foot and wiped the soles of his shoes on the giant man's body. Chapter 2105. AI Faye's nerves were stretched to the limit. It was one thing to encounter the same thing after so many years, but she didn't expect that Mr. Hades' family would be involved as well. Chaotic sounds came from outside the cellar. Mr. Hades seemed to be struggling with the thug, and he was screaming in pain. "Mara, I have to go out. I can't let Mr. Hades suffer, because of me." "But Miss..." Mara grabbed AI Faye's sleeve. "If something happens to Mr. Hades' family because of me, my soul will never be forgiven." AI Faye looked into Mara's eyes and said, "Then I'll go out with you." Mara let go of her hand and said with a firm gaze. AI Faye held the dagger and climbed up the ladder. She pried open the locked cellar door and pushed it open. As the cellar door slowly opened, screams of pain could be clearly heard. AI Faye and Mara's faces were slightly pale, but they still pushed the cellar door open. "I'm here, don't." AI Faye jumped out of the cellar and shouted. Then her eyes suddenly widened, and she looked at the huge man lying on the ground and screaming in disbelief. Meg, who had one foot on the giant's indescribable position, and Amy, who was sitting on a small chair.
Crack. It was the sound of his balls breaking. "Ah."
"I'm sorry, I was nervous." Meg took back his foot and took half a step back as he said apologetically. "Ah," the giant screamed as his eyeballs popped out. He was in so much pain that he almost fainted. Mara also jumped out of the cellar with a bottle of wine in her hand. She already had a look of desperation on her face.
She just happened to see the scene.
Crack. The wine bottle fell to the ground and shattered. "Miss AI Faye, Mara, are you alright?" Meg looked at AI Faye and asked with a smile. His voice was filled with concern. I'm fine." AI Faye tried hard to look away from the thug on the ground. There were 3 bright red lines on his face, 2 disfigured hands, and something seemed to be broken between his legs. "Mr. Hades, you..." AI Faye wanted to show concern for them, but it seemed that the current situation was beyond her understanding. A thug that was fierce enough to cut through a magic barrier set up by a 5th-rank mage was reduced to such a miserable state after encountering Hades and his daughter. It was simply unimaginable. "We were just about to sleep when we heard an unusual sound, so we came over to take a look. I didn't expect to see this big idiot crazily hurting himself as soon as I entered the room. He even smashed his own hand. The situation is critical, so I can only use some special methods to calm him down." Meg looked at Effie with a smile. "You should believe me, right?" AI Faye looked at the gentle smile on Meg's face, and her panicked heart seemed to be soothed. That kind of security was something she hadn't felt for many years. All these years, she had never thought of finding herself a person to snuggle up to. She would rather make the cellar more solid than find herself a man. But at this moment, she suddenly thought, if Mr. Hades was by their side tonight, then she wouldn't have to hide in the cellar, right? "I believe you." AI Faye nodded. "Woo woo woo." The giant lying on the ground stared at Meg with his eyes wide open, as if he had something to say about his dignity. Although the situation is a bit complicated, This big idiot still revealed some information to thank me for stopping his impulse to hurt himself. Meg nodded and said, "Do you have any irreconcilable enemies? The kind that would buy your life in the black market?" "Sell my life in the black market?" AI Faye's expression changed slightly as she looked at the thug on the ground. Sure enough, her previous guess was right. This guy didn't just come for the money. "I shouldn't have any enemies. These years, Titan Tavern's business hasn't been good, let alone the jealousy of my peers." AI Faye shook her head. "Yes, our family's miss gets along well with the neighbors. She has never been angry." Mara nodded. "So it's like that," Meg muttered, and his eyes fell on the giant on the ground again. "This hero, when did you accept this black market mission? Tell me the details," Meg asked with a smile, and one of his feet stepped on the giant's arm.
"Don't step."
I'll tell you everything," the giant hurriedly shouted, afraid that Meg would cause another accident. "This mission just appeared on the black market yesterday. The requirement is to kidnap the owner of Titan Tavern, then burn down the tavern and tavern. The commission is 1 million copper coins. The employer will confirm the result himself. After the mission is completed, the employer will receive half of the commission. The employer will give the delivery address through the black market and receive the rest of the commission." The giant quickly finished his words. Then Meg still broke his arm. "Treating two weak ladies like this, you're really despicable." Meg retracted his foot and looked at the screaming giant with disdain. "Fuck," the giant cursed. However, before he could finish his sentence, a folding chair hit him in the face. "Have some manners, don't use profanity." Amy held the chair with one hand and said in a childish voice. AI Faye looked at the giant's face that had turned into a square, and then looked at Amy. She was a little confused, saying the most civilized words and doing the most ferocious work. The giant's face turned red, and he snorted a few times. His temper was gone. "Obviously, the mastermind is after you and the Titan wine in the tavern, Miss AI Faye," Meg said to AI Faye. A new mission that had just appeared yesterday, with a high commission and a clear target, but not a clear direction. Moreover, the mastermind was very cautious. They issued the mission through the black market without any direct contact with the culprit. Even the commission was done through the black market. Who could it be? "We just got the gold award yesterday." AI Faye frowned, puzzled. "Actually, it's very simple to find the mastermind. As long as we complete the black market mission and hand you over to him, we'll naturally know who's behind all this." Meg smiled. "Mr. Hades, you mean to burn down the tavern and then hand me over to the mastermind?" AI Faye looked at Meg, and her expression changed. 1 million copper coins. That's a lot of money. Amy sat down again and counted with her fingers. Meg looked at the nervous AI Faye and Mara and quickly shook his head with a smile. "Don't misunderstand, I mean, we can direct a scene and personally meet the mastermind. Of course, we can't burn down the tavern, and we can't destroy the tavern. But what should we do?" AI Faye frowned. "Isn't there a tool here?" Meg smiled and squatted down beside the giant. He patted his shoulder and said, "Right?" Chapter 2106. That night, something big happened on Romo Street. The owner of the Titan Tavern, Miss Effie, who had just won the gold medal of the wine tasting conference, was robbed after business hours. All the profits of the day were stolen, and the owner, Effie, and her maid, Mara, disappeared. Only a pool of blood and a mess was left at the scene. It was said that the scene was set on fire. Fortunately, the good neighbor, Mr. Hades, found the fire in time and put it out, saving some losses. The next morning, this incident spread throughout Romo Street and the entire tavern world of Rodu. Everyone sighed at this. "I didn't expect this to happen to Boss Effie again. Fate is so unfair." "Yeah, Miss Effie is such a good person. Why did she have to be involved in this? Let's pray for Miss Effie. Let's hope she's fine. This time, the Titan Tavern won't disappear just like that, right?" The neighbors gathered together and looked at the Titan tavern that had been cordoned off by the soldiers with heavy expressions. "Did you sleep well last night?" Meg, who was scooping porridge, asked Ify with a smile as she came downstairs. I slept very well." Ify nodded. She was also a little surprised that she could fall asleep as soon as she lay down on the bed last night. She hadn't slept so comfortably in a long time. Ify walked to Meg and bowed deeply as she thanked him sincerely. The bed was very comfortable. "Thank you very much for last night." "You're welcome. We're neighbors, so we should help each other." Meg shook his head. Fortunately, his wife wasn't at home. Otherwise, such a strange sentence would definitely cause unnecessary misunderstandings. AI Faye also realized that her words were a little strange, and a faint blush appeared on her face. Soon, she caught a whiff of a rich aroma, and she looked at the bowl in Mag's hand with a surprised expression as she said, "It smells so good. Is this your porridge?" As she said that, her stomach started to grumble uncontrollably. "Yes, I cooked some porridge in the morning and made a few steamers of soup dumplings." Meg nodded and turned off the fire in the steamer at the side. He said, "If Miss Ify is hungry, have some porridge first. I'll go and wake the children up." "It's okay, I won't."
Gulyalu.
AI Faye was defeated by her stomach, and she accepted the porridge that Mag passed to her. The warm bowl, like his hand, made people feel at ease, and Effie's heart slightly rippled. "By the way, is your wife not at home?" AI Faye asked curiously. After all the commotion yesterday, she and Mara were brought home by Mag, but they didn't see his wife. "Oh, she went back to her mother's house. She should be back today," Meg answered casually. He took off his apron and went upstairs. AI Faye looked at Meg's back and couldn't help but think, Mr. Hades is really a good man. He can take care of a child by himself and still make such a delicious breakfast. I envy his wife. By the way, the neighbors are praying for you at the entrance of your tavern. Today, you and Mara will stay on the second floor of the tavern. Don't go out or show your face." Meg quickly came downstairs. He looked at AI Faye, who was taking small bites of the porridge, and said, "I'll go to the Yamen to record my statement, and then I'll go to the black market to contact the person who issued the mission." AI Faye didn't expect Meg to come down so quickly. She quickly put down the spoon, pursed her lips, and nodded.
Okay.
Meg looked at her and pointed at the corner of her mouth with a smile. "There's a grain of porridge." AI Faye quickly licked the corner of her mouth with her tongue and blushed. "Is it to your liking?" Meg sat down across from her. "Yes, Mr. Hades's porridge is the most delicious I've ever had." AI Faye nodded. These words were completely from the heart. She had never had such delicious porridge. The translucent and bouncy mysterious ingredients, as well as the smooth and tender lean meat. The texture was so smooth that even her soul was soothed with just one bite. Soon Amy and Mara also came downstairs. "Wow, can we eat soup dumplings this morning?" "My favorite." Amy looked at the tall steamer basket, and her eyes lit up. Mississippi, Mara rubbed her sleepy eyes and sat down next to AI Faye. However, she quickly got up and greeted Meg. Meg brought the soup dumplings over. Without needing him to say anything, Amy had already started to demonstrate to AI Faye and Mara how to take a soup dumpling out of the steamer basket and how to eat it properly. AI Faye and Mara looked at Amy's actions with astonishment. As they smelled the aroma of meat wafting through the air and watched the little girl drink the broth, they couldn't help but swallow their saliva. "Mr. Hades, did you also personally make these exquisite pastries?" AI Faye asked in disbelief as she looked at Meg, who was sitting across from her. "Yes, I don't know if it's to your liking." Meg nodded and also took a soup dumpling for himself. AI Faye copied Amy and picked up a soup dumpling. The thin skin of the dumpling was filled with broth. After picking it up, she shook it left and right as if it would explode at any time. She carefully placed it into her shallow plate and breathed a sigh of relief. These soup dumplings were really amazing. She didn't know how Mr. Hades was able to completely wrap the broth into the thin skin of the dumpling. Then she copied Amy and took a small bite on the top of the soup dumpling. The broth immediately gushed out from the hole. She quickly covered the hole with her mouth and sipped the broth in small mouthfuls.
Hot.
The soup dumplings had just come out of the oven, and the broth inside was still a little hot. However, when the delicious broth entered her mouth, her attention was immediately focused on the broth. It was so delicious that it was intoxicating, and it completely suppressed the burning sensation. Oh, what an amazing smell! I can't describe this feeling. AI Faye's delicate eyebrows raised slightly. Compared to the delicious porridge, the broth was more invasive and hard to resist. When the broth was almost finished, AI Faye raised her head and licked her lips as if she hadn't had enough. Then she used her chopsticks to pick up the already shriveled bun and took a bite. The chewy skin wrapped around the meat that was soaked in broth. It wasn't fat or greasy, and it was smooth in the mouth. It was another wonderful experience. It's really delicious. AI Faye put down her chopsticks and looked at Meg with a face full of praise. Your cooking is amazing. Yes, she was starting to feel a little jealous of Irina. To be able to marry such a gentle and considerate man who could cook such delicious food, it was really enviable. Delicious, too delicious. I want to cry. Mara held the bowl and licked the broth at the bottom with tears in her eyes. Eat, there's enough for you. Meg smiled and gave her another bun. This little girl was quite honest. After Meg finished his breakfast, AI Faye and Mara took the initiative to wash the dishes, and he went out directly. However, when he opened the door, a group of neighbors immediately surrounded him. Boss Hades, what happened last night? Chapter 20:107. Mag recounted what happened last night with a lot of exaggeration. The intensity was no less than Tsun Takashi beating up Laifu. In the end, he had to make an excuse that he had to go to the yamen to give a statement, and only then was he able to extricate himself from the onlookers. There were customers from the Ministry of Law who had been drinking at Saipan Tavern these past few days, so they recognized Meg. On top of that, he was Duke Abraham, so they didn't make things difficult for him. Instead, they allowed him to give a statement and even commended him. Boss Hades, if you have any news about this case today, please contact us immediately. The staff walked Mag to the door and reminded him, also, you have to take care of your safety. All right, thank you. Mag nodded, and then left right away. The thug was still being held captive on the roof of his building, and he had obtained some information about the black market from him the night before. After passing 5 streets, he turned into an alley, and when he emerged from another alley, Meg had already changed his disguise. He was a chubby man with sideburns all over his face. His disguise was quite particular. His nickname was Kabaz, and he was a vicious character in the black market. It was a pity that he was a stutterer and didn't speak much. Before going to the black market, Meg went to 2 intelligence agencies and bought some information about the black market. The black market was a secret organization in the underground world of Rodu. People engaged in shady transactions here. Slaves, lives, elves. As long as you had the money, the black market could satisfy all of your needs. Not only was this black market renowned in Rodu, but it was also renowned throughout the entire Norland continent. It was said that the black market had a secret relationship with the royal family of the Roth Empire, and that was why it had been entrenched in the underground world of Rodu for so many years. This massive underground organization didn't have a massive headquarters. Instead, it had many scattered strongholds scattered all over Rodu. Those who held the black market badge would be allowed to enter the strongholds, and they would be able to entrust missions to the black market or accept missions from others. In order to play it safe, Meg didn't use the badge that the thug had given him last night. Instead, he bought a new badge from the intelligence agency, which was equivalent to obtaining a new identity in the underground world. Anyone could accept missions from the black market, and there were no restrictions. They only cared about the rewards and rewards. This was undoubtedly good news for Meg. Meg went to the nearest black market contact point. It was a rather dilapidated bungalow. After showing his dog tag and entering, he put on a tattered mask and followed a short man in a black robe into the underground passage. After passing through a long passageway, a rather spacious hall appeared. There were quite a number of people in the hall. They all looked rather valiant and had obvious characteristics. The masks on their faces were just for show. Everyone wanted to make a name for themselves in the martial arts world, so they would usually dress up in a special way. It would be best if they could be thrown out as soon as they appeared. For example, Meg was attracted by the girl in front of him who was carrying a huge sunflower on her shoulder. He thought to himself, if you peel off the sunflower seeds, wouldn't they be bigger than walnuts? Handwritten mission slips were hung on the wall. Most of the people in the hall were crowded in front of the mission board, thinking about what mission to accept. There was a wooden plaque beside the mission list. Taking the wooden plaque was equivalent to accepting the mission. Each contact point only had one mission slot. Therefore, when some missions with high rewards appeared, it was not uncommon to see people fighting over the missions. Meg also took a few glances. There were all kinds of strange missions. Killing people accounted for 1/3 of the missions. There were also requests to buy all kinds of magical beast cubs, elven maids, succubi ladies, goblin Lola's wait. The last guy's taste is a little special? Meg withdrew his gaze and walked straight to the mission exchange hall. Lifting the black curtain, a passageway appeared. There were 2 black-robed men standing in front of the passageway. They reached out and stopped Meg. Meg took out a black plaque and threw it over. One of the black-robed men caught the plaque and checked it. He nodded and returned the plaque, making way for Meg to pass. At the end of the passageway was a black iron door. Meg walked to the door, and the iron door slowly opened inwards. Inside the door was a display window. On the wall, there was only a hole the size of a human head. It was pitch black behind the hole, and there was a wooden stool in front of the display window. Our brave mercenary, what mission did you complete? A hoarse voice came from behind the hole. Kidnapped a woman. Mag sat down on that wooden stool and casually tossed that amulet into that black hole. His expression was nonchalant, but his eyes were carefully sizing up that black hole. The office naturally could not be pitch black. It was just a high-level camouflage. Okay, please wait a moment. We need to verify. The hoarse voice sounded, and then it was completely silent. About 15 minutes later, the hoarse voice sounded again. Sorry for the long wait. After our verification, the owner of Titan Tavern was indeed kidnapped. It seems that she is in your hands. However, one of the missions was to burn down the wine cellar and tavern. Unfortunately, you did not complete it. According to the rules, you can only get half of the commission. I clearly set the place on fire. Meg spat. Oh, you did set her on fire, but it was extinguished by the owner of the tavern opposite her. If you need it, you can post a revenge mission here. A slightly cheerful voice came from inside the room. No need. Meg raised his eyebrows. This black market really knows how to do business? Here is a deposit of $250,000 and the delivery address and time. We will inform the employer, but we cannot guarantee that you will get the rest of the commission. A black money bag and a piece of paper were handed out from the black hole. Okay. Meg grabbed the heavy money bag and the piece of paper, got up and left. Out of the black market, Meg found an alley and opened the money bag. It was full of golden dragon coins, 250 dragon coins. Then he opened the piece of paper. On it was written, Broken tiled house at the end of Earth Building Alley in the west of the city. Meg put away the piece of paper and dispelled his disguise. He hailed a horse-drawn carriage and went straight to Earth Building Alley in the west of the city. The coachman took Meg's money and looked at the dilapidated alley as he asked, I don't even see a single person here. There are quite a lot of scum here. What are you doing here, sir? I'm here to see a friend. Meg jumped down from the carriage with a smile. He looked on as the horse-drawn carriage sped away, then made his way toward Earth Building Alley 3 streets away in an unhurried manner. The slums of Rodu were situated in the west of the city, and Earth Building Alley was even more secluded. There were dilapidated walls on both sides of the street, and the roads were filled with weeds. To be able to find such a secluded place in Rodu, it was clear that this wasn't the first time that this person was plotting something like this. Meg climbed over a few walls and arrived at the courtyard at the end of Earth Building Alley. However, he didn't enter Earth Building Alley directly. "There's no one here?" Meg stood outside the courtyard for a while with a puzzled look on his face. "Interesting. Looks like I have to make the act real to lure the snake out of its hole." You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.